Oh, it was beautiful. I love Chanda. Was that on?
Yes. I hope the whole world
knows that I love Chanda.
Loves Chanda. But, okay, I think we're gonna get started. Good morning, everyone. It's May 11th, 2024, with another edition of the Society of Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. And today, like the email discussed, as everyone knows, the encampment at the University of Pennsylvania was shut down yesterday, early in the morning. And so we're gonna first start with Doc with a discussion on April 4th, 1967 to April 2024. Where do we go from here, and what is the next stage of struggle? And then we'll have Nuri talk about the encampment and also the shutdown by not just the Penn police, but the Philly police, kind of a reflection assessment. And then we'll end with an update on our June 1st and 2nd conference on the crisis of science and the struggle for revolutionary epistemology. So without further ado, I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Montero.
Thank you very much, Emily Dong, and good morning to everybody. And it's really great to be here, the high point of my week. We were all at the encampment, and of course, I want to thank Nuri and Michelle and Purba for the unbelievable work that they did. And when Nuri speaks and reports on things, I want to give my reactions in more depth. But it was quite the opposite of what I was preparing for. And now with the encampment being destroyed by the University of Pennsylvania, the governor of the state of Pennsylvania, a cold-blooded Zionist, and the mayor of the city of Philadelphia all colluded against a peaceful act of civil disobedience in the name of peace and against genocide. But we'll come back to that. And I'm concerned with how the students will process this. And I met many friends there. I felt that I'd become friends with people that I did not know or ever think that I would know, but we'll get back to that. But now they must be prepared for the more difficult part of it all, and that is to move forward. And to move forward means ideological clarity. The question that King asked in the 1968-67 book, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And that question is on the table as we speak. In 1989, the Harvard professor Samuel P. Huntington publishes a book called The Clash of Civilizations. I don't remember the subtitle as we speak, but the title says it all. This became the playbook and the ideological framing of the neocons' wars in the Middle East from 1990 up till the present. I want to underline the clash of civilizations. I think it has to be interpreted as the war against civilization waged by the West. A couple of years after that book is published, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I want to re-emphasize that this was not a signifier of the failure of a social system, but an act of betrayal by leaders of the Soviet Union, in the first place, Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Yeltsin. In trying to understand our present moment we have to understand that moment. Because the collapse of the Soviet Union undermined the entire architecture of the world communist, peace, democratic, and national liberation forces. No one, absolutely no one, believed that the Western intelligence could penetrate to the highest level of the Soviet state, which it did. And so Gorbachev and Yeltsin were effectively agents of Western imperialism. There's no two ways about it. You can ask me a lot of questions about that. I lived through it, was active in the ideological struggle within the world communist movement, and I'm not exaggerating at all about that. I was. And I saw the disintegration of the Communist Party of the United States. I saw the disintegration of the World Communist Movement, of the Communist Party of South Africa, which was a great blow to the liberation forces on the African continent. And again, you all ask me questions, I can explain it better if you ask me questions, but it was a setback that was unexpected and in a lot of ways transformed the architecture and trajectory of the struggle for world peace and for national liberation and democracy. And I'll say it again, I'll say it over and over again, and I don't give a damn what pro-imperialist, pro-empire journalists and politicians and academics say. The world communist movement was the greatest force for world peace ever assembled in human history. And it was not just communist. It was an array of forces from the national liberation forces in Asia and Africa to scientists and intellectuals and public figures like Robeson and Du Bois, and on and on and on. It was the greatest movement, I think, in the history of humanity. It was further invigorated and fueled by the defeat of Nazism. I wish to return to that because we are, again, witnessing the struggle against Nazism. I keep saying I want to underline. As you know, I have made a distinction between fascism, i.e. the movement that emerges in Italy in 1921, led by Benito Mussolini, and Nazism, the spearhead of world reaction. And there is a difference. What we are seeing in Israel and what the fight is against Nazism. And I want to come back to that. As you know, we've been saying this for many months now. Others are saying the same thing, not because we said it, but because, one cannot conclude anything other than that. But in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the world socialist and communist movement, Francis Fukuyama publishes a book 2 or 3 years after Samuel Huntington's, entitled The End of History and the Last Man, using a fake form of Hegelian historical analysis, and it is fake. Again, parenthetically, in the Western countries, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States and Britain in particular, Hegel has always attempted to be appropriated to the liberal framework, thereby replacing human history with the history of societies and cultures that uphold the individual. We'll have to return to that. In other words, Hegel, with all of the flaws of his framework, and there were flaws, was looking at human history as ending when the human is elevated to the centrality of history and consciousness. Did he know how to do it? I don't think so. But Francis Fukuyama, whose book, by the way, is entitled The End of History, subtitle, And the Last Man, which I think tells us a great deal about what he's doing. He links Hegel not to human history, but to those societies which uphold the individual. In other words, to the Enlightenment and its manifestation or concretization in Western white civilization. Huntington's book and then Francis Fukuyama's further development, I think, of the claim openly called for war against Muslim civilization as a moment in the West's war against human civilization itself. That is why, when I talk to Purpa, Shantanu, and Sambarta, and when I speak to people from China and Korea, there is something that grades against you at a deep, deep level. Sometimes it's not expressed. You might not know how to express it. But it's not just the blatant racism, because in a lot of ways, you all don't experience the blatant racism, but there's something deeper and more subtle. It is a war against your soul, a war against that which you come from. Hence, a war against your civilization. They don't oppose China because they're Chinese. They oppose a civilization. They don't oppose India because you're brown people. They oppose you because of the civilization. And therefore, when Chinese or Koreans or Indians perform whiteness in this country, it is such a grotesque performance because they are performing a form of civilizational hatred that they would join with the enemies of Indian or Chinese or African civilizations, join with their enemies to destroy these civilizations. And so when Francis Fukuyama talks about the end of history, what he's saying is the victory of Western civilization over all other civilizations. We have reached now a new qualitative stage in this struggle. And this is why, to fully understand this moment, one must understand it in relationship to the struggle for civilization against the West, which is committed. And this is the great danger. This is what makes it so emotional, committed to the decimation of civilizations. I know when we did the Korea conference, the thing that we emphasize is a civilization of peace. That the division of the Korean people made no sense except as it served the civilization of the enemies of all Koreans. by the way, a very ancient civilization, a civilization that in history precedes the Western civilization, precedes the Enlightenment, precedes modern Western rationality and individualism, the whole thing. But suddenly, these thousands of years of history mean nothing if, for example, like Jeremiah, you posted Sigmund Rhee, an open Nazi, who would wipe out all Koreans if it served the interests of American imperialism. That war on civilization is in effect what we call the Cold War. The Cold War is not adequate to explain what was going on. The German Nazis openly declared their militarism and their wars as a defense of Western and white civilization. Hitler went east, went to the Soviet Union, because they viewed Eastern Europe and Slavic peoples as non-Western and non-white, which is still I think, the essence, if not a major kernel, of the hatred of Russia by Western Europeans and Americans. The hatred of Russia, not just the disagreement with Russian policy, but the hatred of Russia. That is what was part of what was driving Hitler's push, military push, to the East, Poland, and ultimately the Soviet Union. And it was a war of civilization. It's quite interesting that too many Russians view themselves as white rather than as Asian. And if you go to the Soviet Union, it is more Asian than white. And certainly even the white people are not Western, they're Slavic. And there's a difference. First of all, just as I often talk about linguistic groups, the Slavic languages are closer to the Asian languages as linguistic groups, closer than they are to the Western linguistic groups, even the Nordic Germanic or the Romance linguistic groups. For this reason, Paul Robeson, reflecting upon his own experience and learning of languages, would say that because he knew African languages, Russian was a much easier language for him to learn, affirming what linguists and population geneticists are concluding, that going back to ancient times, there was in fact a civilizational axis going from the center of Africa to Eastern Europe. In other words, Slavic languages have more in common with Bantu languages of Central Africa. I think Bantu, maybe Nilo, because, by the way, just again, parentheses, there are at least 4 major linguistic groups in Africa, which means that Africa is multi-civilizational. But nonetheless, a civilizational axis from the center of Africa to Eastern Europe, and thus Slavic languages have more in common with ancient African, in particular Bantu languages, than they do with the Germanic or the Romance languages of Western Europe. This is still a contested area of research, because if this is gotten right, human civilizational history looks vastly different than the claims of historians over the last 500 years. The other thing, just as kind of maybe a footnote to this, the linguistic histories of people is very important, as is the population genetic histories. As an analogy, it's just like trying to talk about gender and gender identity without wanting to recognize the biological foundation of human sex differences and how gender, however it is discussed, must acknowledge that. History is not the history of great men, not the history of great nations, not the history of war. At its foundation is the history of language, the genetic history of populations, and such. Just a small thing. Language and linguistic groups are the boundary setters for civilizations. So, as you know, I know I'm going a little bit astray, but forgive me. Just like we challenge whether Ashkenazi Jews are Semites. They're neither linguistically nor genetically Semitic. They're not. And to continue to talk in this way is the falsification of actual history for the purposes of attacking civilization. I'll get back to that. The other thing is geneticists and linguists who are doing just, what I'm talking about, discovered a group of South Africans in South Africa who repeatedly claimed that their heritage were the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Israelites. So everybody laughed at them. Oh, they're just a Jewish sect, making claims that can't be verified. And anything that goes against white supremacy is a joke. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, then, population geneticists, and this is a very important area of social, archaeological, and other forms of research, population genetics, took what are the DNA from ancient populations that can still be found in what is Israel, Palestine, and such, and tested it against this group of South Africans. And what did they discover? They discovered that, in fact, this group of South Africans who had obviously migrated, and human migration and the way that the various continents have been populated, we didn't all live where we live today. There was the populating of the planet with anatomically modern human beings like us. And that was a long, many 100,000-year process. So people, in spite of all of the migration that we see today, if you go back to more ancient times, when I say more ancient times, I'm talking about even pre-sedentary agriculture, where people were more nomadic, etc. People moved, thousands of miles, and they discovered that indeed these South Africans had the same DNA as the ancient populations of Palestine. And in fact, their language was closer to the ancient Hebrew than to any other language in South Africa. In other words, they were genetically closer to people of Palestine than they were to other South Africans. And I would suggest you could look up the research. And linguistically, their language was closer to ancient Hebrew than this fake language that is spoken today. The other side of this is that the Ashkenazi Jews have no linguistic or genetic connection to what is called the Middle East. Okay? However, to substantiate a claim, a political claim, they have invented a fake history which has no basis in linguistic or genetic research and science. But how do you sustain a lie? I guess this is the Baldwinian question. How do you sustain a lie of this magnitude? A lie that justifies genocide? You have to attack the truth. And the closer we get to the truth, and this is the question of the student encampment, the closer they get to the truth of the situation, the greater the repression. The lie of white supremacy must be sustained at any cost. The greatest and most significant parallel to what we're seeing in Israel is Nazi Germany. And I am not being rhetorical. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm not trying to go over the top to make a political case at all. The parallels are so deep that one only can avoid it by closing one's eyes to it. And certainly at a time like this, there cannot be any compromise with a lie. At one time we could do it, maybe. Of course, the best of humanity wouldn't do it. And they paid a price for it, you know? And of course, the heroes of the free school are the people who would not compromise with a lie. And I think that's what makes the free school such a distinct project. Hitler said his war against the Soviet Union was a war against Bolshevism. But Bolshevism was a marker, a signifier in the brains and minds of Western people and certainly Western elites for the trajectory in history away from the Western idea of the individual, of reason, of Western reason, of law. I want to come back to that. As the state, as representing a defense of Western civilization, often articulated as a defense of the individual. Here again, I wish to emphasize the individual and not the human. If it is the human that is defended, then the articulation becomes like Martin Luther King. We all wrapped in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects us all indirectly. The bombs dropped in Vietnam explode in Detroit. It is a different language. It is a different philosophy. It is a different civilizational worldview. And therefore, when King talked about a new form of ecumenism, bringing together religions, of Hinduism, of Islam, of Christianity, of Buddhism, why did King, unlike, let us say, Samuel P. Huntington or Francis Fukuyama consult the ancient wisdom of the Buddha, of China? Why did he go to India?
Right. Yeah.
It was the human rather than the individual. And you read King over and over and over again. It is a rejection of egoism, of the performance of egoism. The same in Baldwin.
Yeah.
You know, don't separate me from Black people because I write books. You start saying,
Right.
don't align me with something that I don't align myself with, like your sexual identity questions. I prefer men, but then I prefer women too. But then I love humanity. You see, the argument and the construction of it and the questions asked and answered are so vastly different from what the narrow white construction. When King asks the question, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Chaos is a signifier for the continuation of Western hegemony. Community is a signifier for the end of Western hegemony and the hegemony of the people. And he says, I won't quote it, but in this book, or maybe I should, in the last chapter, where do we go from here? He says, he asked the question, I think it is appropriate for us. And I think as we go forward with the students, and I know there's going to be psychological fallout. I know they probably are disappointed. Some might ask, was it worth it? And so on. But King writes, and this is his last book, quote, what we are seeing now is a freedom explosion, the realization of an idea whose time has come. Freedom, that is, to use Victor Hugo's phrase. The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses. I just want to repeat that. The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom. In one majestic chorus, the rising masses are singing in the words of our freedom song, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, by the way, which the students are singing at their encampments. All over the world, like a fever, freedom is spreading in the widest liberation movement in history. The widest liberation movement in history. The great masses of people are determined to end the exploitation of their races and lands. They are awake and moving towards their goal like a tidal wave. Just the uses of the concept race. Race, as it is used in modern social science, that is post-World War II social science, is not the way it was always used. In fact, it has been used in multiple ways, more in many different ways prior to modern sociology. I'm talking about post-World War II sociology, which, because of the influence of positivism, has reduced it to either an identity, a construction, or biological characteristic. But when Du Bois writes his famous essay, The Conservation of Races, in 1897, it was kind of his inaugural speech, at the founding of the American Negro Academy, which, again, parenthetically, they first thought of naming it the African Academy, the first academic institution of Black people in the Western world. This was in 1897. And Du Bois gives a kind of inaugural speech entitled The Conservation of Races. The word races is used to signify or to mean civilization. So when he talks about the conservation of civilization, he is particularly talking about the conservation of African civilization. However, as his oeuvre develops, he would be talking about the conservation of ancient civilizations against the onslaught of the West. And therefore, it was not illogical or unreasonable for him to be not just an internationalist, but what we call an intercivilizationalist. It is this explosion of freedom in the world today, a new qualitative stage in the struggle for freedom, a stage which is the onset of a great human transformation, which could not have been imagined by European writers of the 19th century. It only became apparent, I think, first in the African American thinkers, Du Bois in the first place, that the issue of human liberation was a question of civilization. And that's why, for example, the revolution of values, as King articulates it, is the struggle for human beings to be made anew and hence to love one another, a value which one cannot extract from a philosophical architecture rooted in the centrality of the individual and rampant narcissism and egotism. The beloved community is a community where I love you as much or more than I love myself. I love your children as much as I love my own children. And thus I sacrifice my individuality for the best of the whole. And the whole is expanded the more we know, the more we grow, the more we mature to include humanity as such. And hence freedom is connected to the beloved community. Freedom is connected to civilization. And freedom is connected to humanity as such. I am not fighting for my civil rights to say I can fit in to an American society that has denied me human and civil rights all of my existence in this country. But the civil rights struggle, as King indicates, was only a stage in the greater struggle for human rights. And I'm not interpreting his words or extracting my interpretation from his words. He says it like that. Finally, I just like, just one thing. The Western state, as all states, are civilizational states. A lot of commentators have said, well, the Chinese state is not a Western state, a liberal state, as it were, but a civilization state. But all states are civilization states. Marx would say that the state upholds the interests of the dominant class. However, it is more than that. I think Hegel was closer to it in his writings on right, R-I-G-H-T, right, or who would say rights. Every state is in defense of a civilization. Every great war in the modern epoch is a civilizational war. Even among states of the same civilization. And certainly in the period of colonialism and imperialism, what Lenin did not see, and I'm not casting blame or anything, is the civilizational nature of war and of the state. When I think about India and Modi, he's trying to assert a civilizational state on the cheap. By just cheap, trying to assert it without really establishing what it is. If India is anything, it is a multi-civilizational state. China is more like a mono-civilization state, but not completely, You ain't gonna get no 1.4 billion people and everybody the same. But India, with 1,000 languages and so many customs, it is multi-civilizational. And the construction of the modern Indian state will be a modern multi-civilizational state. But nonetheless, the Western model, which is more unicivilizational, cannot fit multi-civilizational, ancient civilizational nations. The nation state is, like for India and China, the nation civilizational state. The nation, but the state, a nation of more boundaries in relationship to other nations in a multinational global environment. But that does not address what the state is. The state is civilization, has always been. Western political theoretical discourse obscures more than it clarifies. Because in the name of the individual, it says a new type of state that protects the individual is constructed. A state that is bounded by laws. That is what the Constitution is. That is what the common law in England is. That is what the fundamental law in the Soviet Union is. It is the law that defines the state and its relationship to the population of the nation. So in the United States, you hear a discourse, and we hear it so much that it's normalized within our subconsciousness. It's not just something that we read about or value. It's something that is deeply rooted in the substructure of our consciousness, that the state is the government, that the government governs on behalf of the state, and the government and the fundamental law, i.e. the Constitution, is designed to protect the individual from the abuses of the state. Okay, well and good, enlightenment thinking, I feel your pain, etc. You understand? But you've obscured so much else. And that is the human. The human is connected to the civilizational. The civilizational and the human puts the collectivity, the people, the civilization ahead of the individual. The state is founded upon values, as King said, human values that can neither be, how did he put it, neither be
Maybe.
values that can neither be, trying to remember his words, but the essence of what he is saying, there are certain values that come before the state. There are certain values that precede the construction of the individual as a legal entity. Let's keep it 100. In law and in constitutional law and in state theory, we are constructions of the state, not the other way around. I mean, so I'm beginning to laugh because there is a moment of complete absurdity in the whole thing. It is fake, in a sense, you know, not fake in its existence, but the narrative is rooted in a fake set of assumptions. And Baldwin, properly read, is always pushing against it. He uses his own experience of being a Black American to challenge the claims of white civilization. That's why he says to his nephew, you must be patient and you must teach these undeveloped people. That's what I call the Baldwinian paradox. But that is what they're pushing against. It's in King, it's in Baldwin, it's in Du Bois. They're pushing against. I make a claim that it's in the Black religious tradition, the prophetic tradition. You know, part of and there are many levels of a conflict between Black people and American Jews. You know, one of the points of conflict is over who are the chosen people. It's all over Black religion. And I think that's very different from the Presbyterianism that you were raised up with, because you did not have to confront these questions. See, for Black theology, the central question is freedom. And we trace the concept freedom to the Bible. That's what we mean by the children of Israel being cast into the desert. And we, not all of us, but in our theology, there is also the claim that we are the chosen people and we are the people that the ancient prophets talked about. Now, most religion, white religion in the United States, connected as it is to the state and to Western civilization, cast all of those questions aside. But for us, it is indispensable that we locate ourselves as an enslaved and oppressed people in the religion that we proclaim, making Christianity authentically Black for us. And we, just to forgive me if I'm not trying to go off on a tangent, but I'm relating it to civilization. This is in Baldwin. This is deep in Baldwin. We see, as Howard Thurman proclaimed, the main message of the Bible is freedom. The main audience for the message of Jesus is the disinherited and the oppressed. This is not a religion of the white elites or the privileged. That's Howard Thurman. And so our theology, our religious practice, which is far more vibrant than the white religions. I mean, we've seen that through our own experience. We go to Zion Baptist Church. It's a different kind of feeling, the gesturing, the culture, everything is different. You go to a white church, everything is transactional. You know, you got to pay, we're going to charge you the most, and then we ain't going to treat you right, no way, because our religion ain't about we treat people, but about how much money we can make doing this. I mean, it's so. Now, I ain't gonna say that Black people ain't hustling too, you know. But I'm saying at the core of our narrative, our narrative, is the sense that not only are we the people that the ancient prophets were talking about, but we are the fulfillment of prophecy, and that we will be free, even if I don't get to go there with you. That's King's confidence, because the Bible says it's so. Isn't that interesting? He could have added, because my interpretation of the Bible says it's so. And thus he challenges in his life, in his struggle, white Christianity as what? Hypocritical. You say one thing and you do 1,000 things that are different from what you say. You say you're about freedom, but you're about money and you're about power. And that's what the letter from a Birmingham jail is all about. And if you challenge my right to dissent, what you were saying is that you're challenging my right to be free. And he would say in King, as a Christian, as a follower of he who gave his life. You see what I'm saying? The way he would talk. I am compelled by religion and morality to dissent at the expense of even my life. This is what he was saying. This revolution of values recenter civilization away from the West. Civil rights is but a stage towards the remaking of America. If you obscure that in King, you committed a crime against his life and his teaching. The Saturday Free School, which anchors ourselves in these great thinkers, the Black proletariat, unapologetically saying through their imaginary, through their moral imperative, they are the beginning of a new civilization in the United States. And it's so. That's not made up. It is very apparent. You know, I often say the white man took everything he could take from us. You know, it does put you at a deficit when for 300 years it was illegal for you to even have a family. I mean, not just proscribed, but illegal. A man could not claim to be a father of children. The only way, and this is in Toni Morrison's famous novel, Beloved. The only way I know, or the best way that I know that you're my brother, that this is my brother, my biological sister, is through my mother. You see what I'm saying? This is why our system of genealogy is so at odds with the white world. So much so that white sociologists in the 60s, such as Moynihan and Glaser and others, said that our culture, Black culture, was pathological. And they said the reason that it was so is because our family genealogy was not through the father. That rather than a male-centered monogamy, we practice multiple forms of genealogy, including polyandry. That is, where you trace genealogy through your mother. You see what I'm saying? It is not unusual, nor is it condemned among Black people if a woman has more than one child by different men. It is not, I mean, it's normal, you know, and we see, and that's why you get with Baldwin. That's what Baldwin is. He's always that subtext. He's working in subtext and text, and I mean, he's moving. I mean, just it's too complex for a lot of white folk. I put it that way. Even the ones that hold up a copy of Black Reconstruction, you don't know what you're reading. Stop faking, stop performing, you know, cut the dramatics. They can't hear Baldwin. They want to reduce what Baldwin is saying. He says, look, he takes his own family. His father was not his biological father. Baldwin was kind of not just the big brother, but the surrogate father for his younger siblings. He performed for them what he felt a father should perform for his children, that is, to love them. And he had to come to terms with the fact that given our history, his father could not love because he could not love himself. And so his father defaulted to a kind of authority rather than love. And what Baldwin argues against authority, and what King does too, against legal authority, is love, the human. So, so among Black people, a culture within a culture, a civilization within a civilization, a nation within a nation, you go into our churches. First of all, Black churches tend not to be puritanical about sex. You see what I'm saying? But also, we don't accept the white man's values about family. His family values, we don't, that's y'all. I mean, people don't say it, but we act like that. You see what I'm saying? And therefore, and Du Bois discovers this in the work Souls of Black Folk, the chapter entitled,
The first one?
I think it's the chapter entitled The Faith of the Fathers.
Yeah.
I think where he talks about among Black people, all three major forms of family genealogy are operative. Monogamy, male-centered monogamy, which tends to be more loose male monogamy. It is not the strict hierarchical monogamy of the white ideal. You see what I'm saying? That is, children's genealogy is traced through the father. Okay. Polygamy. Sometimes we use the word polygamy to mean polygamy. Polygamy is one man, more than one wife, and all of the children's genealogy is through the father. And here in E. Franklin Frazier's book on the Black social system, E. Franklin Frazier's A Black Sociology from the 40s, parentheses. The two books on family and genealogy that I've found most informative for me are Frederick Engel's The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and E. Franklin Frazier's Study of the Black Family. I think it's called The Black Family in U.S. History. And Franklin Frazier says, well, Black family has to, if we are to progress in America, our families must replicate or look more like the white family. You see what I'm saying? But in saying all of that, he verifies the existence of what Du Bois saw in 1903. These three forms of family. And the last one was the polygyny, not polyandry, polygamy. I may have said, I didn't mean polyandry. Polyandry is about love, and so polygamy is about family genealogy. Yes. The mother is the person through whom your genealogy is determined. Polyandry. Polyandry. Polyamorous. I'm getting all these polys confused.
Oh, yeah. Polygon.
Yeah, but polyandry is the most liberated form. And hence, this is what Angela Davis discovers in her famous essay, which I think should be a famous essay, on, how did she put it? Black women, slavery, something.
Right.
But what she discovers is that the conditions of labor of Black men and Black women under slavery were so similar, is that such that a hierarchy, a gender hierarchy, had a great difficulty in being constructed. Because but women had an extra burden of labor, and that was childbearing. You see what I'm saying? That's the polyandrous situation. And now, if you go among us, you see all three. You see all three coexisting in the same community without anybody saying, well, you wrong, or, that, well, you can get somebody that you can go to certain churches and they might try to perform that, but they don't have many members. So I say all of that to say a civilization within a civilization in conflict with a dominant civilization. And, this is what I was getting at. The white man took all that he could take from us. All that he could take. And, as such, when we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about repairing the economic inequalities. This is civilizational. A radical revolution of values, to use King's words. And in fact, the white masses ain't gonna have no alternative but to act more like Black people. You see, we could get more into that. But we wouldn't and never have relinquished or sacrificed our music. We never gave it up. Never. And hence, I don't care how you cut it, our music is something in itself. I mean, it is the measure of all music. Although white people try to keep some bullshit going, it is Black music. No white performer artist, except those who take from the Black tradition, ever reached the level of Black music. It's almost embarrassing. So much so that the poet Amiri Baraka used to say about the white man is a very corny dude. And that's the way we saw that. No rhythm, can't dance. And if you don't have rhythm, you know what I'm talking about. That. No rhythm. Or very immature rhythmic and melodic and performative. performances.
Yeah.
They don't come anywhere near.
No style is going.
Well, they don't have style, but they don't have rhythm. They don't understand complex harmonies, nor the narratives. And of course, I was saying to the students at Penn, the great white music comes in the civil rights period, classic rock, which openly acknowledged a debt to the blues, openly, and got halfway real. But never having arrived, there is no white Curtis Mayfield, not even Bob Dylan. Or what's the guy from over Jersey?
Bruce Springsteen.
Bruce Springsteen. For us, it's like, okay, nice. But y'all keep that. We got our own thing. And that's, she's been around us. We wouldn't give it up. Why? That's our poetry, that's our narrative, that's our history, that's us. The fact that we held on to our music, which is more than music, explains a lot about us and how our character, who we are, But I'm not going to say, but just the free school, I know this. Free school is a wheel within a wheel. Or in quantum mechanical terms, as an analogy, we are a wheel among many wheels within a larger wheel. If you look at the wheel within the wheel as the atom, and the nucleus of the atom, and the subatomic particles as many wheels within a larger wheel. Free school is a wheel within a wheel. And what sustains us is the force of ideas and values, and our aspiration to know the truth. And the belief in the old Christian sense, it is the truth that will free you. A lie keeps you enslaved. And that's why the ruling class is so committed to lies. And they're a bunch of no good liars. So where do we go from here? The we as the we of the free school, and the we as the we of the many wheels within the wheel. There is no way out except through what King talks about. The people have to know in order to know how to be free, how to free themselves. We cannot be free just because we want to be free. There is a precondition, a conditionality. Freedom is mediated through the truth. There's a mediation. There is no existent freedom as something in itself. That's why Judith Butler don't make no sense in the human sense. You're beautiful, liberal, white liberal. Keep it like that. You're not struggling for human rights. Because if you were, you would consult humanity. You ain't consulted humanity, least of all Black humanity. We are in that moment, this quality that the world is on the precipice of a great transformation. The student movement is such a valuable contribution to this. We owe them a debt of gratitude. We cannot mechanically apply let us say, experience to explain this moment of student protest. In fact, if one from back in the day is to be real, this is a higher level of struggle. But yet to go forward will require more than just courage, will require knowledge of our history, which, as the Free School has said, is the history of the Black proletariat. I'll stop there. Finish up.
Can I say something? I just wanted to, like, where you ended, Doc, the question of the student movement being at a higher stage. I know we'll talk about it in a bit, but something that I was also thinking about because I was talking to some people about it. Something it said at the teaching was also that how previous student movements, anti-war movement, was driven by the draft, by this injustice of being forced to go to war for an unjust cause, and the fact that that is no longer the precondition for these movements says something about this time and the level of maturity of these students, where there is, like, for the first time, it's the students only have something to lose and not as much to gain from participating
As individuals.
as individuals. They have everything to lose, and nothing really is attacking their safety except their willingness to stand for what is right. And in some ways, I mean, it reminds me so much of what Baldwin talks about, the American sense of reality and this defaulting to a safety, this need to basically keep your life circumscribed by certain boundaries which you don't cross because it threatens your individual prosperity or status or whatever. But in some ways, the fact that this kind of a movement is possible today almost suggests like a fulfillment of what the Black freedom movement stood for. This idea that there is no safety that you can struggle for. And yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah, because sort of, I feel like the logic has changed in some ways, where I think if the premise of like the main motivation for students standing up against like the Vietnam War, like the white university students, was the draft, then in some ways ending the war and removing the draft then almost satisfies the condition.
You're right.
To no longer feel like, oh, like now I don't have to struggle, like I've gotten what I wanted. But I feel like today you're not really fighting directly for yourself. And so actually when you stand up and then you're punished, then I think it pushes you to realize like, oh, actually like all of this was kind of a lie this whole time. Like this myth of safety was a lie. Like you only protected me because you thought I was on your side. Like you only protected me because you thought I was like in this like individualism, like that I wanted to be elite. But I see you and you're on the side of like murder. You're on the side of genocide. I don't want anything to do with you. Because part of what I feel is that with the arrest, like there's demoralization, I think, especially among like young people. But the broader sense that I feel is like, oh, like actually it's not just that you have contempt, like for the Palestinians, it's not just that you have contempt for like random specific other people. You have contempt for everybody. Like you actually have contempt for like human beings in general.
Right.
And there's nothing that you stand for. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting where it almost like every crackdown or every punishment, I think there's a way that you can interpret it to say like, actually, like I can't be discouraged because it shows me something basically deeper about, I think, yeah, like collective freedom or this sense of like the human being. And that to try to disentangle yourself or like disconnect from that and then return to being an individual instead would be, I think, a betrayal of like basically what you know to be true. And I feel like that also connects to like this thing of like how the lie of white supremacy has to be sustained, where like it's not just that you can go back to pretending ignorance for the sake of safety. It's that you actually have to say like I'm engaging back in a lie. And yeah, I was also thinking a little bit about, I guess, where that myth of white supremacy has gone. Like for this generation in a way, where I do feel like I was thinking about how like our formulation is that yeah, the American people in general are less racist than they have been before. And I feel like amongst young people, there's more just like overall curiosity. Like there's more of a tendency of like, yeah, like I'm curious to know about other civilizations. Like I want to know what that's like. And I think for like an older, like different, like basically like white boomers, like some of them I feel like feel so much contempt for the students because they're like, why don't you want to be white? Like why don't you want to be like basically like the past?
Well, why don't you want the protection of whiteness? We have protected you. That's what the university administrators are saying. And you're defying our protection. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Well, it's taking me a long time to put together my thoughts because sometimes I think I take too many notes and then I get lost. But I actually think the thing that really stood out to me was you defining the moment about civilization. I actually think the category civilization is hugely significant to frame it as such. Because I think in free school we've talked about civilization, but I don't think, at least for me, I realized the urgency of that category or to view it like that until now. That even that it's one thing to say that Israel's genocide of the Palestinians is a civilizational war, but actually it's a reflection of that it's been a long crisis of essentially like that all wars this whole time were actually wars of civilization, that every state defends not a people, but a civilizational, a certain worldview or outlook. I actually think that's really important because that's also why it was actually really deep that both Jeremiah's Facebook posts about Simon Rhee and Netanyahu being similar. But then you took it, you extrapolated it by saying that you're saying that Simon Rhee is a Nazi, which is to say that Nazism, there's a reason why today, where essentially the US government or the US ruling elite, you could say like the Western world, has to face a moment where, like the moment that Baldwin talked about, which is that a new world is painfully being born. And the Western world in some ways has to face the fact that I lost my train of thought. But yeah, just that they put up this thing about like, oh, we have a crisis of fascism and democracy, when actually it's more about Nazism. It's more about Nazism as a reflection of Nazism is not just a more accurate term, but it's a more defining, clarifying way of understanding that what Hitler is doing in overt defense of white supremacy is also an attack, an attempt to completely destroy civilization, which is also destroy the very thing that defines humanity, the human being. And that's not only what Israel is doing, but it's also what someone like Syngman Rhee or those who almost are exactly, there's something very grotesque about trying to betray that source of human civilization. But yeah, just this thing of civilization I think is really important because it also reminded me of what you said at the teach-in, which is that one of the most damaging things today is for people to not just believe that revolutionaries come from Europe or revolutionaries are made by European thought.
Yeah. There it is.
But also that Europeans, that it comes from, Lenin, this was Lenin, that Lenin was great, but that there's something really significant that I think in some ways that we have the benefit of the civil rights movement, but all the people who, revolution didn't stop with Lenin and the Soviet Union. The people especially the Black proletariat, contributed to this world understanding of revolution by also something Lenin didn't understand, like you said, is basically that war is not, tell me if this is right or not, but Lenin would say that war is because of imperialism
And class.
and class. But actually, this is where Du Bois comes in, where, because I was, when you were talking, I suddenly thought about like Du Bois's manuscript, Russia and America, where his last chapter is called World Peace, I think.
Right.
Maybe one of his last chapters. And Du Bois makes a point. What I used to attach on was the way Du Bois said that war is defined by its degradation of the world's labor, which first and foremost is the Black proletariat, and secondly would be the colonized peoples of the world. But then there was a few lines that because I first read Russian America when years ago, where I think I wasn't thinking about civilization. But then when I was rereading some of it, he says, like Du Bois uses the word civilization, but it's just that I wasn't attracted to it at the time. Where Du Bois was like, war is defined by, he essentially says in his own language that war is always, like the reason why he says colonized peoples, or he says the Black proletariat, he's making a point about war is an attack on civilization itself, which is why King or Baldwin see the antidote as like the remaking of the human being and the human, like reinsertion of human. And they always use those terms, like King says, the story of the future will talk about a great people called the Black people who injected humanity back into American civilization. Or Baldwin says it too, where he says he's talking about the bicentennial, like the 200th anniversary of, he writes an essay for the 200th anniversary of America's founding, where he says like the only gift these bicentennial presidential candidates can offer the American people is freedom from the poor.
Yeah.
A stunning gift indeed for so original a people whose originality resides entirely and precisely in the poverty which drove them to these shores. It is like offering the American people on their birthday freedom from the past and freedom from any responsibility for the present. For the poor are always with us, and they can also be against us. And this is all to say that I think the civilizational framing is important because it also helps. First of all, it is the defining question of the world moment, which is, it made me think of also the recent UN vote, where so many countries, including France, which I found interesting, so many countries, it's like very beautiful. It's like the way that I think 2 years ago when the countries were voting on Ukraine, like we had that really fun free school where we were reading out which members of the UN Security Council were in support of Russia or like were basically against the US's war in Ukraine. And it's like basically that's the real world house. It's the darker peoples of the world, but 194 countries all supported this for Palestine to be a full member of the UN. And it was only, I think it was like maybe 8 or 9 countries who voted against, and then a bunch of abstentions. You know, a bunch of the abstentions are the countries like the UK, or I think maybe even the US. US voted against. But it was a lot of countries that where, you know, abstaining essentially is them both saying like, like the UK can't, maybe they didn't vote against because also they're fucked up because their own people are upset by the war in Palestine. But it made me kind of want to cry actually seeing the vote, because you have this sense of like a trumpet is being sounded of a new era, a new epoch, and it is civilizationally defined of like a reclaiming of like that civilization is not dead. The last man has not lived. And and a new man will stand out of all of this. I can't read my handwriting. Oh, okay. My last point is, and I totally agree with what Nuri and Prabha was saying about the student movement, because when I was thinking a lot about it, and I know we'll get into it with Encampment, but I think the way I see the student movement today, like, is especially as superior in consciousness, superior to 1968, is like what Nuri was pointing out that you had said about the draft, that 1968 was against a very distinct policy draft. there's no draft today.
Yeah.
So what makes these young people stand up so courageously, more courageously than Occupy, more courageously than even like our time with whatever Trump and stuff. But it's, or even like any Palestinian, whatever, like when I was in college. And it is because it's a certain consciousness that has opened up, which is what Baldwin talks about, which is he's like, when will the real Americans stand up? Like, when will the real Americans realize that the American situation, like that there is no freedom from the poor, there's no freedom from anything, because that is just a resignation to chaos, more and more chaos.
Could I just say, or freedom from responsibility?
Yes. And he says the only freedom is to take responsibility. He's like, the only freedom is to take responsibility.
Right.
And not to acknowledge the past. And which is also why Baldwin says the most white thing you can do is to see the past as like sentimental nostalgia. He's like, what nostalgia? Like everything is there's no history, there's just nostalgia. Because to understand history is to understand responsibility for the present.
Right.
And I think that's the deep thing about the students, and then this is where you land with knowledge, because there's something more. It's not, the first step is courage, but the second step is now knowledge, science, however you want to say.
That's a good way to put it.
But I do think it was important to acknowledge that what's very like advanced about students today is that moral courage. There's a certain courage that that lights a certain spark, and to say like, it's what Purvo was saying, which is like, it's not like we're opposing a draft, and we're not even opposing a policy. And it's to say that it's in some ways come back to the human being, which is what Nuri was saying, which is to fight for the Palestinians, to also fight for myself.
Right.
That there is no escaping anymore. The only way out is to begin to take responsibility for something, whether you see it as yourself or your institution. And the last thing I want to underline that in what you said is free school. I think it was really significant that you described free school as a wheel within a wheel. I think that's very important. I feel like recently I've really slowed down in a good way. That I think that it's what you said, that revolution is a long game, because revolution is not about what you do. Revolution is the force of ideas.
Right.
And if you can't do that, then you're also not going to be able to truly understand the real foundation of the future of this country. And there's something about knowing that I feel like recently I've really been obsessed with understanding myself and also free school and what I'm doing with my purpose, as I'm coming back home to this thing of like the ideological struggle, and that there's nothing more real, there's nothing more powerful than the ideological struggle. And ideas are not abstract, but ideas are that wheel within the wheel. And that free school, or that, you could say free school is a wheel among many wheels within the wheel, the ultimate wheel of the destiny, the single the destiny of the future, the destiny of the people to claim the future. But that free school is that one of many important engines of that ideological struggle that allows a future to even be conceived. And I think that's important. I know talk for a while, but that's also why the civilizational thing is really important. And I just want to really agree with you, Doc, that King, Du Bois, Baldwin, like those people, like those are the main, those main people, those main men who lived, that they're, in some ways you could say, yes, they were smart people, intellectuals, revolutionary intellectuals. But I actually think, like I was telling Alice this morning when I was reading about Du Bois, but like Du Bois is not just a smart guy, like he applied Marxism to the American situation, Black Reconstruction, but actually Du Bois, as like, in some ways you could say all three of them were highly obsessed with what King called the revolution of values. And that's not a sentimental, like religious term, but actually the revolution of values is essentially like has to do with a defense of civilization as a concept, the defense of the human being, but then the beginning of like out of the Black proletariat, himself is like the beginning of like creating a new civilization that in some ways, in a beautiful but also painful way, must always struggle against the existing dominant civilization. There's something and that's what makes America, I think, such a like difficult nut to crack, but also the most important nut to crack for all of humanity.
Exactly.
Like it's in some ways it's a very like religious, like God-like. It's almost like a very religious thing of like our destiny, like the the American people's destiny on behalf of like the future of humanity. And yeah, because Baldwin, I mean, it's all over Baldwin, like you said. Like every essay is actually exactly what you said about like civilization. And I won't say it now, but the part that I would like to come back to is also when you described the Black man, like the Black man, the Black proletariat, the significance of the life world, like the significance of the life world of the Black proletariat, the Black person, like the Black community in America, as in some ways like a civilization within a civilization, like the womb for all of America. Yeah, because that's what Baldwin. That's what Baldwin is interested in.
Can I go again? Short. I just wanted to add to what Emily was saying, because what you were saying, Doc, it also made me think about knowledge's relation to this category of civilization.
Right.
Right? And what you were saying about Du Bois and King, for them, the issue of human liberation being a question of civilization, but then also a precondition for freedom and liberation being knowledge, being able, or the human being able to know the world. And like, the more you know the world, the closer you come to the truth. And I mean, this relates to what you had said before about how, the lie or the myth of white supremacy, but also in a similar way, its microcosm, which is Zionism, that lie, in order to sustain itself, has to more directly and more ferociously attack the truth as you get closer and closer to it. So they are always counterposed to knowledge. They're always counterposed to knowledge in its liberatory, emancipatory potential. And I think this is how we're looking at the university right now also, and the student movement in contrast, because they're really trying to establish, whether they articulate it directly or explicitly like this or not, it's really trying to establish a new basis for knowledge.
Absolutely.
That actually, allows the flowering of human civilizational values, which in some ways are universal. That is why King talks about the single garment of destiny. And clarifying that is important, because otherwise there's a way to see. Just looking at the different ways, people are talking about the student movement as just protests, or, just like being exactly like what had been or whatever, you lose this new quality or new character if you do not see it through the lens of civilization or a new basis for knowledge itself. Yeah, I think that's where I left.
I wanted to add something. Well, I agree with everybody about, like looking at the category of civilization being very important. And I was thinking of, where you started, of like looking at the defense of, liberal democracy, for example, as like really a defense of white civilization, of Western civilization. I think it's really deep, especially because like the question that has come to the table now with the genocide and the student movement and so on is that we are faced with the question of what are the essential features of a civilization. And we can see that the essence of Western civilization is inseparable from war. And therefore the question is, what is the way forward? And we talk about, like we're talking about the Black freedom movement and the Black freedom tradition as having something to offer. But I think what you were saying really made it clear that that in order to take humanity forward, which has been captured by Western civilization, the way forward also needs a civilization. And this like also needs principles that come from a civilization, or the essential features that constitute a civilization. And I think it is the freedom struggles that make up the basis for every civilization, not the struggle to be, the struggle for freedom. Which, I was thinking of this when you're talking about India and, like what is to be the basis of a new Indian people, for instance. But I think the question is more clear here, because we have had this history of the Black freedom movement, which most sharply articulates, and especially through Baldwin, that it is the civilizational standards of white America which we challenge at every step in order to forge a new way forward. And and I think like today's moment where we see the like what Emily was saying, that like with the General Assembly and so on, where we see and repeatedly that the entire world is really coming to the same conclusions. I think it's a proof of what we mean when we say the universal in Black civilization, or like what counts as the Black proletariat. This is the proof of the universal and
Universally concrete.
of the concrete universal. And like I think like where we really need to move forward, which we are trying to do, and like which the student movement has shown that it's inevitable that we'll move in this direction, is what we were saying, the basis of knowledge, which has been tied to the civilizational standard of the West, but it also serves to perpetuate them. And so therefore it makes sense that it must be through Baldwin, who will look to challenge the standards of knowledge, or the standards which create the basis for knowledge today. I just wanted to add that. I know we'll talk about it later, but this is like, it seems that this is the moment where Baldwin must speak to the crisis of knowledge and the crisis of Western civilization.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I just want to add, I think it was important to me when we started with Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations thesis, because I haven't read it, but to my layman's understanding of it is that Huntington is saying that civilizations are destined to clash, basically, and that this becomes the justification for the West in its wars against other civilizations, because Huntington is saying like, oh, this is just the story of human history. This is what all civilizations do. Therefore, the West is actually just following in the same pattern that other civilizations have followed. And I think if we're also trying at the same time to, I guess, seek for a new kind of logic of civilization, while also arguing for the defense of civilization, and especially non-Western civilizations, then I think we're also dealing with, if war is not actually in human history the kind of written into the DNA of humankind, as like what civilizations are destined to do, then like we're searching for, is there another kind of path for the resolution of the crisis of civilization in this time, and especially the crisis of the West? And I think it also reminded me of like King's pilgrimage to nonviolence. What he's saying, part of what he's not fully on board with Marxism is, he's like, oh, I think that there are like basically the dialectical logic of human history is more complex than what Marx and Engels were describing. And what King, I feel like, is basically saying is that the logic of human history is a logic of civilization and the dialectics of civilization. And I think it also, but then I feel like, it also reminded me of, I think since we read The Souls of Black Folk, like something that stayed with me is how Du Bois talks about like a world within a world. And like the color line laws, but especially that phrase, the world within a world, because I guess part of what I'm trying to like work out in my head is, if we consider America not just as an experiment in, let's say, like the class struggle, but also an experiment in civilization, then the logic of the revolution, of the contradictions of America, have to take that into account. Because, for instance, when Du Bois is saying that, basically the life world of the Black proletariat is like a world within a world within mainstream American white society, the resolution of that contradiction and of that dialectic is not just like Black people overthrowing white people, for instance, right? It's not the same logic of the proletariat overthrowing and basically liquidating the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. And I think that's part of what I think people get confused about with nonviolence, because it's simultaneously a method of class struggle,
Yes.
but it is also a method for the resolution of the contradictions of America as basically like a civilization, but also a proto-civilization within that civilization. And at least that's what I'm trying to work out, because like part of the, basically what King is saying is that the only way to resolve the civilizational contradiction of America is through love and through nonviolence.
Yeah.
And it is basically like white people have to become Black, but the way that they do that is not through literally, like Black people overthrowing white people, but it is literally through what nonviolence was doing and through love. And I think that's also important because, like, also I was thinking about Nandita's essay in the recent issue of Avant-Garde, where like she was also making the point that it's like for Gandhi and for people like Tagore, like the central category for civilization was essentially like love, but not love in the way that like most like Westerners or most Americans think about it, like especially the pop culture sense, but in a much deeper way, where like part of the reason why Gandhi was even able to make the argument for nonviolence as in a new stage of struggle against British imperialism was because he was saying nonviolence has been actually part of almost like the civilizational DNA of Indian civilization over hundreds of years. And this is the only reason why Indian civilization has been able to endure is because of the nonviolence of basically the masses of people. But I just think that like part of what is difficult but also exciting about dealing with America is that, like you're dealing with a very complex and unusual not just class struggle dynamic, but also like what we're talking about with like this question of civilization. And I agree with Emily that if we're able to work this out, then like it is going to be a contribution to world humanity and to the world's future.
Like when you had sent me the UN vote, I read it and I wasn't affected the same way. But then when you told me, because we were on the phone, and you told me it was a time of poetry, I was like, it must be, but that's also different than it has to be, right? And I think like it's really funny how that phrase came up, and it's kind of rolling in my head still, because I feel like while in free school, it's almost like I had to reflect back to even first reading Du Bois, or like first reading like, I think I'll stay with Du Bois in the essence of like, I think Dark Princess affected us in a certain way, and it gave us a certain framing of like, well, what do we mean by beauty, or what do we mean? And I think even at that point, when we were discussing in the year of Du Bois, that there's a certain time of poetry, like a certain time where why aren't there more art being produced? Because there's a question of where is the art even being produced from, like from what particular value standpoint. And then like, I appreciated the call. I want to tell you that I appreciated the call, but I also think that it's making me now, like, I think it is, I think it's important, this thing about ideology. Like, actually, Jeremiah, what you're saying points out to me how I get excited. I'm interested in the complexities involved in this process of freedom, because I think it still stands, like you have pointed out with the Black prophetic tradition, like what we know as what religion really is, which means that like we're talking about when we say freedom, like we can see it in the music, or we can, like, I feel like we're coming close closer in free school, particularly to getting to a language that specifies what we mean by revolutionary, or what we mean by freedom, or what we mean by democracy or peace. And I think that's also significant for me, because I think that represents a certain way that we can talk in general, like we're with either the Penn students or like even the whole reconciling that we had about the Tagore event and the relationship that the Tagore event had to India broadly and then to China. And then because I think okay, so the nature of the ideological struggle in my mind also brings up like this point that you're making about nonviolence. How is it that there's an inner struggle, like a philosophical, like a moral, this religious, as well as like there's the larger historical, like why is it that the children of Reconstruction went back south? Like those kinds of questions. What made nonviolence significant to them, and how are they also able to then use it to give us a certain criteria, a certain value, like a value criteria in understanding struggle, especially in America, which is why I think it is important that you pointed out that the nature of this particular moment, the nature of this particular struggle is also a certain key or a certain stage to a new epoch, or what could allow to a new epoch. Because I was thinking the exact same thing. If the United States could become a new, in the way that it is the last white nation, then it's almost the biggest struggle. Like it's the biggest struggle in world history, where also amongst or in the world we're talking about a Afro-Asiatic civilizational reconstruction upon that basis, or a reconstruction on that basis of the Afro-Asiatic unity, and that is the basis of like what we know as to be like peace, or even what we know as to what poetry we could even produce. And like you had said, like the last man has not lived yet. Like I thought that was really interesting, because it also comes out in our lives, like in the sense of, well, I want to be something, but I'm not quite yet that. And I think that's also interesting that you point out your own as well as my own, like the struggle to become something. Like I'm going in at the same time, you know? But then also the thing about the individual and how that is, you know, both a moral question as well as like it is a moral question versus the word or the notion of the human and how the human is embedded with this thing about love that I feel also that we don't fully get, because we say love and we say, okay, well, love is prefaced by the Western ideal, the Western civilization, and thus that says that we don't actually get it. And to me, I think that that was almost a certain key, because it connects why wait, I'm trying to find it also. Like, oh fuck. Let me slow down. No, but I was just
You said you could deal with the question of love, right?
right, but
Were you kind of posing that to the individual, the supremacy of the individual?
right. Yeah, I was, but
And
I
then you
was
try to suit.
right.
And
Go ahead.
you know, this is very important, because if you take existential philosophy, they try to infuse love into the category of the individual, which is the more fundamental category in Western political thinking. And then they try to infuse or bring into it love in the human
In the,
without dialectically rejecting the concept of the individual.
well, without truth.
Well, that's another way of
No,
putting it. Yes.
Because that's the whole thing that I thought was deep about why did King go to India?
Yeah.
Or why Du Bois go to
Yeah.
China? And because there's this thing about the relationship between the human and truth instead of the individual and the ego, or like the mind, like as abstracted from history, or because truth is what moves history. Truth is what also makes it possible for the history to be in the present as well as the future to be realizable. Like that's the thing about truth that I find like almost in key to understanding why the ideological struggle is like it defines itself. The ideological struggle is not a philosophical or intellectual project. The ideological struggle is a personal, revolutionary project. Like we can understand what even revolutionary means. Like that's why I feel like in free school we've also been trying to understand, like, you know, it's almost what we were talking about too, to the essence of like when you make compromises with either Western ideals, or if you make certain choices of either giving up on revolutionary struggle, those choices affect your person, your personhood. When a person, people make civilization, and I have an understanding, or I'm coming to an understanding where civilization also comes out of like people actually, like in a way that happens in the home, in the family, in the practice of life, like, and that's the whole purpose of why even Buddha would even want to think about anything at all, of how anything is done, or even why philosophers, like, I feel like, because what I'm getting at is that we are dealing with now a complete renewal, like a complete certain kind of renewal. And that's why revolutionary, when you have to ask what a revolutionary is, then you have to think about science, philosophy, art. You have to think about everything. You have to think about yourself. You have religion. You have to think about what moves it is that you're making in what consideration, because the whole loss of appetite around ideology or whatever, and that it's a white man's thing or whatever, is the fact that there's a loss of knowledge, or there's a loss of a search for the truth, because there's a problem of how to reconcile yourself to the responsibility of actualizing a new human being, a new way of doing things. I think that's the biggest problem of the generation. I think that's the thing that young people complain about the most. Oh, I'm the person who is the brightest, who has to deal with the entire family situation, or has to deal with the entire, like, whatever narrative or something. Like there's a problem with responsibility that I feel like young people probably have been trying to articulate. And I've been thinking about it more, because part of why I feel like ahead sometimes, or why I feel like, why is it that I'm the only one in free school? Why is it that free school hasn't completely caught on as like a part of the fabric, like the fabric of Philadelphia? Because in essence, I really do believe that many people could be in free school at the same time, in the sense of like, well, it's not that we're just a bunch of nerds. It's not that we're just a bunch of like, you know, there's many people interested in knowledge, but knowledge for what? And knowledge towards what? Art for what? Science for what? So it comes back again for me to say that why this conversation starts with this question of civilization is because responsibility, like to take responsibility of civilization, is also something that in a concrete way, in struggle with, you know, we're in struggle with it at the same time that we are seeing possibilities of a new world. Like that's part of the
Well, here, what you said actually it brought me back to what I think is special, or what I think is special reflected in the student movement, because I actually think, in some ways, like, for example, the students in the encampment may not say it like this, but what they're essentially expressing to me is a desire for almost a pure or universal knowledge again.
Yes.
Because actually I actually think some of what you're saying at the end is like, the thing I'm also caught on is that, like, Jeremiah's saying nonviolence and love, but like, or you could say like King's revolution of values, like that thing from Doc's intro where a revolution of values cannot be extracted from the philosophy of the individual. And I really tied that to also why King, I love the phrasing, like you also caught on, like King had to consult Buddha, or King had to go to India. It's a philosophical, civilizational thing. It's like in some ways, King out of a certain, both, in some ways, King is a defender of a civilization that can become, right? Like, King as a defender or representative or like a spearhead of a certain civilization that must defeat the Western civilization to like really allow the people to be free. King had to, in some ways, be valid. He was looking for the validation or the consultants of like Asia or civilization, or you know what I mean? I feel like that, I like the phrasing of like King consulted Buddha, Du Bois had to go to China. But also Du Bois was, he saw Russia in a certain way too. Russia is part of Asia. And I think that's also why Du Bois, actually, no, I'll go into later. And in some ways, it made me think of like when you and Jeremiah brought up love, it made me think about why is it that like a lot of Black artists in particular consulted Asia, or in some ways their own spiritual journey, artistic journey led them to Asia. Like love, like the validation of like love again, love supreme, Allah, like and and I think in some ways that's also why, like you were saying, Serafina, that's why I think the framework of civilization, it becomes really important for young people or students who, whether they know it or not, have entered, like in some ways, they've been slowly been on the ramp again towards what a re-purified or something, like almost like a re-purified pursuit of the truth. And that's also why like free school isn't, the reason why I'm like really attached to this thing of free school being a wheel within a wheel is also because the ideological struggle is also getting at what you said, Doc, that freedom will always be, yes, okay, like we've made the choice that we're going to be courageous, have the courage to actually fight for something which is freedom. But freedom will always be mediated by the truth. Freedom is mediated by something, especially in the time of propaganda, like the militarized propaganda, like aggressive propaganda. Like freedom is mediated by things.
Yes.
And in some ways, that's why whether it's philosophy or religion, both have to do with how do you conceive of freedom? How do you think of freedom? What is the path to freedom? Like that's Buddha's whole thing. It's like freedom, like, you know, like it's like, what is the path to freedom? But is the path to freedom an individual project within yourself, or is it also part of, like, in some ways, okay, I don't really know Buddhism that well, but there's the question of like, we're entering a modern period, a modern futuristic epoch of humanity where freedom will never be found in the individual, like white supremacy, but freedom is like, must be through or mediated through a collective thing, civilizational collective thing that you still get in Asia, which is why Asia will have a future, because they, like, thank God they never betrayed that category of the collective for the category of the individual. Like, I don't know. Anyways, but I think there's something important about the Black proletariat can always find validation of itself as a civilization in Asia. And then lastly, with back to Russia, I also think that's why it was very moving, Doc, when you said that Bolshevism was not a signifier of a superior European philosophy. But actually Bolshevism, everyone knew that Bolshevism was, like, in some ways a very beautiful, like, experiment, a pursuit of that pure universal concrete of what should science and reason ought to be. Like, and it's a civilizational project that actually is much more attached to Asia. It is against Western supremacy, white supremacy.
That's right.
But it was just really great. And that's why Du Bois is also really interested in Russia. It's a very moving, not just defense of world peace, but defense of civilization, and a project to, like, in the face of colonialism, like very explicit Western civilization, white supremacy, like all these other philosophic categories being like stuck in the ground by Europe, that the Soviet Union Bolshevism was it was just a brave experiment of like, let us defend the human being. And I feel like that's important. It's important to see Bolshevism as that, because it's like we've been saying, and we said it at the teach-in, like we said it, Doc, at the teach-in, which is a lot of young people think that economics will lead to a political reality, when it's the opposite. It's always the political struggle that will lead to the economic system that's just and does not exploit. And the political is not even like electoral. Political is not even about Marxism. Political is about values, moral, like the moral philosophical beginnings of what, like, do people deserve to live? What is the human society? Like that is the political struggle that leads to like an economic system that's just, culture that's like freeing, that's just, like education that's just. It's, like people always flip it around, and oh yeah, that's all I have to say.
Because I think that you're pointing out, what I'm thinking about is that I know that the West is also young, like comparatively so. And like in the fact that like I think there just has to be admissions. There just has to be admissions. Like because I also agree that Black music, in the sense of like what we know or what we even don't understand yet of the blues, for example, is the measure of all music. Like, and that whole conversation about like the language and then music, but how it's like, I feel like in America, there is a struggle of civilization. Like there is this kind of like, I don't know, that's probably not the best way to put it, but it is in the nature of like, the problem, like the nature of what, anyway, so that's just to say that. And it's kind of like, it made me think, why do white people, in the sense of like whatever, have to learn. And even with the philosophy, like me and Doc had that one conversation about philosophy, but and so I was looking over a video that talked about Nietzsche, like this guy, I forget, and he was talking about like the Superman concept and how like the Nazis like took over the word or something. And maybe something also in that concept alone, the West is trying to struggle to become more than the individual, but it can't also be through the individual that you become more than the individual. You have to, it's about the civilization, like the framework of the civilization that binds human beings together. And because the whiteness is also this question about a lie, like you're lying about yourself if you think that you're white, or that you can even become white, or even lying then about history. And that's also part of the point that I'm saying now. And if you lie about history, like then you're lying about like this thing that you said, Doc, about lying. I forget how it is that you put it, but I also know that a part of that quality is the betrayal, and that certain betrayal of humanity. Also, there is no children that white people can produce. Like I don't know why, and there's only a need to produce children if there is a qualifier of the economic, like you're saying. And I still even think that the economic qualifications of man or human beings or individuals in society are limited and infantile to a certain extent, because I don't think that that even gets to like the basis of civilization, or even being able to think about civilization in a real way, which means like when we say complexities, we're also saying, well, what is the real nature of how things operate? And that's, you know, kind of part of the issue when you're dealing with what it may or may not be young, or may not, you know, a young civilization like the West in relationship to the civilizations of Africa, Asia, and then on top of it, it being able to oppress Africa, Asia, for a 500 period, then this extraction, like the extraction of imperialism and oppression towards a new human being, at the same time of the West in a certain collapse, like that's the whole nature of the nature of the problem becomes very I guess complicated, or very like particular.
I think in thinking about what you guys are talking about the relationship between truth or knowledge, freedom, and then love as this special force, Jeremiah, that like connects them or animates them. And thinking about Baldwin as a philosopher of these things, I was brought back to that part in the creative process where he says, I'm really trying to make clear the nature of the artist's responsibility to his society. The peculiar nature of this responsibility is that he must never cease warring with it for its sake and for his own. Societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war. And he does at his best what lovers do, which is to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation to make freedom real.
Wow.
And I think what you're saying about the preconditions, what makes them so unavoidable or real in this moment with Palestine is because the relationship between these three is made unavoidable or made clear, or the choice is unavoidable. And I feel like I see it in maybe two examples where at the Wooden Shoe on Tuesday, Shantanu, we were reading Nothing Personal. And in that, Baldwin talks at the end about if you have a lover in Hong Kong and I live in Chicago, you'll learn so much about shipping routes and earthquakes and natural movements. Like because you have a love, you must have a knowledge. You have a thirst for truth. And then Shantanu, you were saying because I've learned so much about war in this moment, I've had to learn so much so quickly. The only conclusion I can draw is that I love these people. And then when we're talking about the student movement, I think again, it's a relationship between these three things in a way that they see what's happening. There's this unavoidable truth of what's happening, confronted daily, and they have made this choice to love the children of Gaza. And in loving that, somehow make freedom real. I remember what you were saying too about when you have a civilization that's centered in a love for humanity, you love others' children more than perhaps your own. And I feel like that's being made real in the student protests. And this signifies a new quality, a new civilizational confrontation that's happening, that the students are confronting the values of a civilization or an anti-civilizational values of the West and saying, these are not compatible with me, I need to find something new.
Yeah, I actually think the nothing personal thing is pretty deep, where it's like, yeah, like if you love somebody in Hong Kong, like that will compel you to like learn all of these things. And I actually feel like that's kind of my feeling about the encampments, which is that they don't know it all yet, but I do feel like they want to. Because part of it, I was thinking about like how interesting or significant it is that they're encampments, but they're also basically saying like, this is a new university. Like we're trying to establish a new university
Yes.
because the knowledge that we're being given is like so woefully insufficient.
Yes.
And yeah, like I was thinking about the programming that they try to do at the encampments, like not just the Penn one, but in general. And I feel like there's, in some ways, like what they have taken it upon themselves to do is almost try to prepare like a free school event every single day for like multiple weeks without like the pre-knowledge to actually like, I guess, do it. But at like Columbia and then also at UChicago, like there is like basically an intercivilizational element where they're reaching for like all the knowledge that they can possibly use, which means like they instinctively, I feel that they need like basically the tradition of the Black proletariat to give them something, or to like to be able to have like the strength to like continue or to like be clear on things. And they're also like, I think, really interested in basically like Afro-Asia and like Asian civilization. Like I was reading this thread about like the UChicago one. Oh, and then it's also because like it's about Palestine. And so there's like Muslim like community members who are basically bringing like a certain aspect of like their civilizations. Like there is like the oud and like the prayers, but at UChicago, I think they said they had live music. At one night, people who knew Urdu sang along to Fez Ahmed Fez, like Kenge. And then a Pakistani student gave context on how Fez wrote this song while in exile in Lebanon. And then they also sang like a Bangla song translated from a Nazim Hikmet poem about Paul Robeson, like Victor Jara songs, like music for liberation from our different homelands. And then like UChicago STEM, they were saying like, oh, like UChicago wants like scientists to use their technical skills for militarism and profit, but we do science for like community. Like Palestinian scientists are our community. And I feel like it's really interesting where obviously there are like hits and misses, but I feel like they're moving towards like basically like if like like if I see the children in Gaza and those are like my children, then like what will it take for me to actually be able to like do right by them? And it's that if I'm a student, like I need knowledge, like actually I'm hungry for knowledge. And if anything, like this form of politics is giving me or like drawing me much closer to like any knowledge, like much superior to any knowledge that like this Western like white university is capable of giving me. And yeah, I think there is like a passion as well as like a hunger for that. So
well, even the fact that they set up a Rifat Al-Arid Memorial Library there, I mean, I don't take that lightly at all. And I don't know when first I saw it, whether I
That's a
fully
question.
Yeah.
Why don't we just start a
Yeah.
new report on there?
I guess so,
And then all of this will come in.
okay, yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'll say it again.
Okay, because I guess part of this is like trying to give the context for the teach-in that happened on Thursday, where I feel like last week when we reported back on preschool, we didn't say that we were going to do teach-in because we hadn't committed to like doing it. But I think over the weekend after preschool and like thinking about it, I felt like since the encampment, like this courage, like how can we connect this courage to like knowledge? I think was sort of the basis. And since preschool, like we were positioned like in Philadelphia, we've been so committed to the ideological struggle, and especially like thinking about like you, Doc, and then also Catherine, like what basically you've given to us as young people. I just felt like it was like basically an opportunity to do something. And so originally we had been planning to do it the Monday, like this coming Monday, but then
That's crazy.
that was the plan. But then on like this past Monday at Lotus meeting, we realized that a lot of undergrads would be like leaving campus this weekend. And so we just decided to try to do it for Thursday. And like, yeah, moved kind of fast. Because yeah, basically the programming side, I feel like was pretty chaotic, where every single day they were trying to fill in like at least 4 events by like outside speakers or teach-ins that like students would do. And because like every night they would basically meet at 8 p.m. and meet for like over an hour to try to finalize the schedule for the next day. And so then they'd have to like call people and be like, okay, like, are you sure we're doing this? And then at the same time, they were trying to basically ideologically develop to say like, this is the bottom line. Like we don't, like for instance, like we don't want people to basically like condemn Palestinian liberation or like whatever like struggles that it's taking. Like anything beyond that, oh, and then also we cannot in good conscience like endorse the Democratic Party. Like I think those were like the two points, which were really interesting. And then beyond that, I feel like it was very exploratory, where it wasn't like, there wasn't really censorship, I feel. And so basically I think programming, like people were working really hard to try to have the encampment not just be like a space that people like come to individually and then stay individually, but basically a place that would move and bring something. And yeah, and I feel like those, like it was not a large group of students who committed themselves to that responsibility, but I think they were really trying their best. And so, okay, we finally figured out that it was happening like around like Wednesday night, and then Thursday was happening, and no, and I feel like the thing is that the other interesting thing is that I do think it was somewhat of a risk where all of us, I feel like, came anticipating like fighting, and but the thing is that we didn't talk about it. I feel like we kept it in some ways to ourselves. No, because the thing is that, like, I think the hope was that we wouldn't have to fight. And I think for me personally, I was like, oh, like, am I just being defensive? Where, like, am I, like, almost anticipating getting attacked just because I'm used to, like, a certain social force in Philadelphia or, like, a certain opposition? But then I was like, oh, I'm going to keep it quiet because maybe this is a different time, or, like, maybe the circumstances or the context are different. Where basically the importance of free school, or like the importance of what we have to say, so vastly outweighs whatever like whatever rumors, whatever slanders, like whatever opposition there is. And yeah, I think that was pretty important or interesting, because my overall impression of the event is that in some ways it felt like, because I guess I could see like the audience better than like most other people in the audience were, because we were facing them. And part of what I felt is that it almost felt like, for me, the first time that I heard you speak Doc, where like the way that I see it is that free school, like we have taken it upon ourselves to try to develop or to understand like this new language, like what must be the new language of the American people. And I feel like we struggle to figure out how to speak it or how to say it the most clearly, so that people can understand it, but also so that people can like almost speak back or like contribute to that language and like participate in it. And I was thinking about it because we had like a pretty rich conversation, I feel like, the three of us, for like an hour and a half. And people were paying attention the whole time. Like not that many people actually got up to leave. Like everybody basically sat down and then like text themselves. And like the few people who left, like was because either I knew them and I knew they had to go somewhere, or they had like other reasons. But yeah, like people were really like attentive, I think, and like really trying to process it. And like the last half hour, like going into it, I think the goal was to actually have like a conversation where almost like the free school town halls, where people really are talking and we're really synthesizing. And the last 30 minutes, like that was what I tried to open it up to, but it didn't seem like that many people wanted to talk, or like they weren't ready to actually like say something yet. But then everybody still was sitting there and like listening, and almost like I think hoping that somebody else would ask a question, or to like basically keep it going. And I think the way that I was trying to understand it was that people really want to hear like basically this language, and people I think can understand it, or like in some way like inside of themselves, like it resonates. Because also like basically like the jokes that you were making, or like when you'd say things, like people would laugh, or like people would like laugh, or like whatever, like snap, like people would be responding and like engaging. But I think it's that the impact that this had, I think, will also take more time for it to show itself and for people to like acknowledge it or process it. But I think it has already made some impact on people, and I think it will continue to do so, because then after that, it felt like, I feel like the end of the event too, like people were lingering and like talking for quite a while, and like we talked with a lot of my friends from biology for like a long time. And Yeah, and I think because the night before had been really tense, there had been a big rally and there had been a lot of police who had come for that rally, and then the encampment had also expanded, so that was kind of an escalation. And so I was actually really worried that the camp was going to get swept on Wednesday night or early morning. But then when I was talking to like some of the organizers, it was like, oh yeah, like camp is really quiet today because usually people get really tense and then they're like chilling the next day. But then I feel like we brought the camp to like another, in some ways, like high point. And then after that, I was like, we're done. Like, we did a great job. Like, can't wait for like how the camp will unfold. And I just went to sleep. And then when I woke up, the camp had been swept. And it was kind of shocking. Because like you go to sleep and then I guess like your guard is down or whatever. And so I just like went to campus because basically they were trying to regroup at this church that is on campus, and it's an Episcopal church, but it's on the campus of Penn. And basically I found out that the reverend, like the main reverend lady, her name is Emily, but she like basically gave sanctuary to the encampment like protesters and like the people after they got swept. And it was interesting where one of the students that I knew, like he had woken up really early in the morning just because he couldn't sleep well. And then he like ran across campus in the rain to try to basically regroup.
Damn.
No, it was pretty deep. And then people were like sort of starting to show up because basically it was like they didn't have that much time. I think they like found out it was going to get swept around or they were anticipating it around like 4:35. And then they gave their first warning at like exactly basically 6 a.m. But the police had already like surrounded them and they're like, oh, you have like 2 minutes to get out. And then at 6:02 they started arresting people. And I just feel like throughout that day, like people felt really shocked because it was like, oh, like how can I wake up and then have it already be gone? And like I couldn't do anything about it in that time. And so I think it felt kind of like you were powerless, and then you also feel a little bit guilty because you're like, oh, like if I'd known, like I would have wanted to do something to stop this. But I also think that it was not a difficult leap for people to make to say like, oh, the police are cowards. Like this is a cowardly force.
Yes.
Like you want to basically attack people at their most defenseless in the early morning, and you want to do it under the cover of like night so that nobody can see you do it. And yeah, I think like thought processing also takes some time, but I will say that when the arrested students were released and like came back, like people did not seem very defeated. Like if anything, people felt much more defiant. Where they're like, oh, like you thought like this was a low move for you to make, and you think that like basically physically dismantling it is going to set us back. Like no, like if anything, like we're all just pissed now. And I think that that's pretty deep, where like I think maybe the youngest students in a way are the most crushed by it because I think like it is a shattered dream. Like the encampment like was something concrete, like it was the embodiment of something positive. And for that to suddenly disappear and to like basically see like the patch of grass and like these giant fences erected where now you can't even walk through that area of campus. And also it was raining the whole day. But I think for the older students, like it was much more just like rage.
It's much more.
I think like rage, like, and yeah, like amongst the organizers, like, oh, like we're pissed. And like the rally that they had at night was like actually like pretty angry. So they hadn't decided whether they wanted to have a rally or not, but then it seems like the overall feeling of like people who had been closely involved was just like they were so angry, and they're like, okay, like let's channel this. And so they had a rally that started at the cemetery, and then they walked to the president's house, and then like screamed outside of the gates for a while, and actually like people went across the gates and like knocked on the door and like banged on it. But like I think it was pretty like intense emotionally because there are also a lot of police there and a lot of helicopters, and it was like from 8 p.m. to like 11. And also like some graduate students met in the evening to basically like figure out like, okay, like are we going to respond to this? Because we can't just like take it lying down. And I think the overall impression that I got is that for people who are affiliated with the university, the police like encirclement and like basically the bullying or like just like the show of force with like the riot gear and like, batons and like manhandling at a ratio of like 10 to 1.
Right.
It like shows one like a level of like just like absolute repression and like also cowardice, I think, by the administration, but also a level of contempt for like basically the entire purpose or like the functioning or all of the people who are part of the university. Which is to say, like, I think people like yesterday or at the teach-in, everyone was like pretty readily able to agree that Penn is a parasite upon like the outside community. And then also that Penn like wants students to basically like put their head down and be individuals. But I think with the rest, like a lot of the way that I see people processing it is like, oh, actually Penn has total contempt for even the faculty and the students and anybody who like is affiliated with it, except for like themselves, like the admin. And that was true because during the protest, like they basically locked off campus, even for students and faculty. And yeah, and so I think it's like it's becoming a real question of like, yeah, who is this university for? Like, who does it serve? And oh yeah, because also one of the chairs of the faculty senate resigned yesterday, and she said like, oh, like basically what happened today reveals that the administration has no interest, or like I don't see any possibility for me to actually productively work with this administration. Like it is so separated from like basically the sentiments of like faculty and students. But yeah, I think that contempt for like basically all of humanity and contempt for like anybody who basically puts the human being above the individual is becoming very clear to people. And yeah, and so I think also this thing of like chaos or community that you're saying is pretty deep. And I think it'll take a lot of thought and a lot of consolidation because yesterday, I actually felt like the university could plunge into like general crisis also, like pretty easily. Like I was really angry yesterday. And so I think this thing of knowledge is also important, where it's the long haul. And oh yeah, but another thing is that the teach-in, I think, was a really significant, like it was a new phenomenon. And I think that it's the start of something because like I talked to one of the undergrads about it yesterday morning, like when we were at the church, and I think he was just kind of like, oh, I didn't know that you could like basically like talk shit about Foucault. And he was like, and he like was happy about it. Yeah, he's a freshman.
That's really nice.
That's really nice.
And he was like, yeah, because also I think he's more into like analytical, but I think like many people don't take like continental philosophy as seriously as like it's supposed to be taken. And actually like another student was like joking because of the few things that made it out of the encampment, a lot of the library made it out, but then top of the library was a book by Derrida, and one of the students was joking like, damn, like we did such a good job, like we couldn't find all the phones that got lost during the scuffle, but we got this Derrida book, so like that's great, I guess. And yeah, and I think like people are thinking about you and Catherine. And another thing is that I think graduate students are working on, in some ways, like writing a statement or in some ways trying to reach a consensus to say that most people, like the majority of graduate students, as well as like the majority of undergrads, think that what's happening is messed up. And I think the idea is that if we know that there's a democratic consensus or a mandate that allows for like unity and like basically moving forward collectively and saying that not only do we think that like arresting students is crazy, like the fact that it was because these students were standing up against genocide and we're against this genocide, we want a ceasefire. And also like beyond that, we think that this demand of divestment is a fair one, but that also if we want divestment, it makes sense that there needs to be disclosure. Because if we don't know anything about how the university functions, like is there any democracy anywhere?
And so I think there's a lot of movement, but in that statement, it was interesting, like, it's kind of like a very rough draft that people are trying to work out, but actually like somebody mentioned, like they explicitly mentioned the teaching that we have.
Damn.
Mention what?
The teaching, like they put your name and Catherine's name in it, and they're like, this is a reference point for us.
Yeah.
It's like a statement that's being written.
What is this?
So basically, like, I think some graduate students are trying to like write a statement to say, to like have like people sign on, almost like in some ways to not have a referendum officially, but to say like, oh, if we can get like 3,000 people to agree to like a basic commitment, then that's a significant portion of like a certain faction of like the Penn community. And so, yeah, I think things are moving very quickly, but I don't think that, I really don't think that the encampment is like the end.
Whatever happened? What's the outcome of the kids that were arrested?
I think they got like citations. So they were arrested, but they weren't charged with anything officially. So the citation means that like maybe it's on the record, and I think they have to pay like a fine. And then it's unclear what the disciplinary outcome is like through Penn. But usually they have like a CSA, which is like a community like sanctions thing, where they will have like a hearing by like, the Open Expression Committee, and that committee, which is faculty, decide or advise what should be done. But then the thing is, the provost has like basically dictatorship over it, where he can overturn or basically pressure it to go.
Provost, one very disgusting black man, John Jackson. Because, you know,
Wow.
So, and then the other aspect of this is that some of the students or the people who were arrested were saying that the Philly PD were not enthusiastic about like breaking up the encampment, and that they were kind of, you know, like dragging their feet, they're complaining, they're going slow, they're like wanting to do a smoke break. And I think part of the, like, I do think that Philadelphia as a city has like a significant role in all of this. Like Philadelphia police in relation to like NYPD, which I feel like is very militarized. And then also, I guess even like Larry Krasner is like, when he said like the ethos of Philadelphia, like the First Amendment, or like what is democracy? I think is a very pressing question here, especially like when you think about Shapiro. Like, yeah, like the statewide politics, which are closer, I think, to like the national, like ruling class, whatever, and some of the role of the local politicians, potentially.
Right.
And Philadelphia. Oh yeah, because it seems like the route of like the punishment is overall not as severe as it could have been. Like comparing it to a lot of other universities. And so I think the question is like, what does that actually mean?
You know, when I woke up on Friday morning, I was feeling really good because I was feeling really like inspired by the teaching. I felt like there were a lot of things that needed to be said and to be heard. And then, you know, I looked at my phone and you know, I read what had happened. And along with the news, there was an email from Penn. And I just want to read out a few sentences from that email that I received. This was sent by, you know, Larry Jameson, who's the interim president of Penn, who about 17, 18 days ago when the encampment started, he also sent us an email saying that an encampment has begun at Penn and we support freedom of speech, and we do not intend to engage with the encampment in any way that hurts the sentiments of the students who are doing this, and we believe that you know, freedom to express your views is a part of blah 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 academic freedom. And then a little over 2 weeks later, this is the email, and I'll read out a little part of it. Our community has been under threat and our campus disrupted for too long. Passion for a cause cannot supersede the safety and operations of our university. This is an unfortunate but necessary step to prevent violence, restore operations, and return our campus to our community. I wonder who the community is, but the protesters refused repeatedly to disband the encampment, to produce identification, to stop threatening, loud and discriminatory speech and behavior, and to comply with instructions from Penn administrations. We could not allow further disruption of our academic mission. We could not allow students to be prevented from accessing study spaces, resources, or participating in commencement ceremony. None of those were actually happening, by the way. We made it clear that their proposals were not possible, including their demands that participating students and faculty receive amnesty without proceeding through our due process for conduct and for divestment from entities engaged with Israel. Penn remains unequivocally opposed to divestment, and it is unlawful for institutions receiving funding from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We proposed and still hope to deploy Penn's academic resources to support rebuilding and scholarly programs in Gaza, Israel, and other areas of the Middle East. Despite diligent efforts to find a path forward, the gap between the positions of many in the encampment and the university proved too wide to bridge in this volatile environment, while the risks to our community and our missions continue to increase. And I wanted to read that out because not only is it untruthful and a lie, most all of it, but it also reveals that what the university always does, You put forward your demand, it can be a demand such as give us an education worth our time and our effort. And what they say is, no, let's do it our way. And if you don't do it our way, we're going to throw you in jail. That's pretty much what they've done. And till now, I guess they have managed to do it, but I don't think they're getting past it this time. And there is a serious depth of bias, I feel, and the way that I was thinking about it, because when I think about these protests and the way that not we, but the American state is reacting to it, I have to think about, because we talked about civilization in India and all of these things today, I can't help but think about, there were student movements or student protest movements, really large ones in 2016 in India. And I have this list where one only needs to examine the headlines from Western media covering the protests in colleges of both countries. While protesting at JNU, which is where Meghna went to, the Washington Post's headline read, Indian students called it free speech, the government called it sedition. Meanwhile, the BBC's headline stated, JNU, students across India protest against campus attack. However, when it came to protests at Columbia University, the BBC supported the US government with its headline, Columbia protesters take over the building after defying deadline. In a similar fashion, the Washington Post said how a Columbia protest sparked a student revolt. So you can really see that the truth and knowledge is being distorted. And I was really moved by today's discussion about how, knowledge is fundamentally linked to being human, and the humans attempt to get to know the world and to know the truth. And in knowing the truth, can you really have a sense of civilization and how to look at civilization? I feel like the most important thing for me, what you said, Doc, was focusing on the human as opposed to the individual creates a different language, different civilization. civilizational worldview. And I feel like we are on this path, we are on this path to rejecting all of this performance, all of this hypocrisy. And we have to choose the community over chaos. I feel like there's no other way. I mean, if we are a wheel within a wheel, I feel like these universities are trapped within a box, they're trapped in a box and they see no way out but, repression and coercion when their hegemonic rule is no longer sufficient. They've drawn the line for freedom, and when people are crossing that line, they are resorting to repression and coercion. My heart goes out to the people in Gaza and to the students who really have nothing to gain as individuals, but everything to gain as human beings.
I wanted to just make my point that I made when I went to the encampment with you, because I'm going down memory lane and with these student protests, and it reminds me of the first time I heard Dr. Montero outside the Sullivan Hall Temple, and the student organizations at Temple would always invite you to speak, and it made me think, and I was also looking at the kufiyas and the people at the encampment and the different ways they wear them, and I was like, oh, that person who's just donned the kufiya, within the last 6 months, and that's okay, but they weren't pro-Palestine people. It wasn't the pro-Palestine crowd. It wasn't, quote unquote, the left at the encampment. Like, that was the university community, and that was the University of Penn calling the police on the faculty and students of its own community. And it reminded me back of the Stadium Stompers. And one time, as part of Stadium Stompers, I went to a meeting with President Engler. And it was my first time watching the women, like Miss Jackie and Miss Ruth, and Wendy and Gail, interact with the administration of Temple. And once President Engler left the room, then the real politics, what they use the verb, the real politics sprung out, and they started talking about the 10-year tax abatement, and it just made me realize like how the president's role in the university is to just make money, and that's all they do. They're just there to talk. That's the main job, is just talk to the alumni and talk to the alumni and raise money for the university. But the university, with Stadium Stompers, it was a clarifying moment for me, and I think the other students, a lot like the way the Gaza genocide is a clarifying moment for all of these students who begin to think, oh, what's my role in all this? And I think it has very little, I think the encampment has little to do, all the encampments have little to do with Palestine, and more to do with a crisis in higher education. Because and I'm not the first person to say this, but what many people say about higher education is that it's become a real estate holding hedge fund with a subsidiary, college attached to it. And when you look at where the money is going for, $1 billion endowment that doesn't pay taxes, it's all going to administration salaries. It's all going to new buildings. It's all going to new stadiums. And so I have the conversations with people at my office, and they're a bunch of old men. And, I thought they would be like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Students are so brave. And instead, they were just a bunch of grumpy, what's the word, bitter old men. Just like, oh, what they're doing is not worth it.
Yeah.
One Indian guy said to me, oh, if my kids were doing this, I'd tell them, hey, knock it off and go to class. And I was just taken aback. But this conversation has illuminated for me the fact that the university is saying, and the parents are probably saying, we provided you the protection of the white world and you're not going to take it. I made all these sacrifices to come to this country,
Yeah.
and you're not gonna, and you're gonna risk it all. And the answer is, and that's why I had to stop having conversations at work. The answer is like, yeah, they're gonna risk it all. But it has more to do with the self-discovery of the students. And yeah, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of them. And you know, the whole student movement. And because I don't think this will stop just because of the summer. I mean, you know, I've been going over that in my head. Like, will this stop just as the students leave? And I don't think it will, because now the students know, oh, this is what really pisses you off. Calling for disclosure and divestment. You know, it's a simple ask, and for that which the majority of the Penn community is asking for, the students and the faculty and the staff. And yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there. The other thing it has to do with Palestine, I think it has to do with the crisis in higher education, that maybe this geopolitical crisis has set off. And that's different from the stadium stompers crisis of gentrification. And that's because it forces you to ask the question, what's my role in all this? The way that Sudan hasn't, the way that the Congo hasn't. And I think that there needs to be in the future going, you know, this is a long struggle. Like, I think that, you know, obviously I brought up Sudan, and I think that people are trying to distract from Palestine by saying, oh, no one's talking about the Sudanese genocide, or no one's talking about the genocide in Congo, or no one's talking about the Black Bottom anymore because we're talking about Palestine. I thought they were all interconnected.
I don't fully agree that it has nothing to do with Palestine, the student encampments, because I guess my interpretation is that the genocide in Gaza has revealed the crisis in higher education, because I think the students themselves are very adamant and clear that whenever stuff happens to them and whenever they face repression, their response is always, this is not about us. It's about the genocide. And it's about what's happening in Palestine. And I think, I don't know, maybe it's just like, I guess I see it differently, but I feel like, but I feel similarly with you though, where like I feel really proud of the students, and I think with the teaching on Thursday, it was really important for the students to hear from Doc and Catherine how much, almost like basically how much you love them, but like actually like how much you appreciate and almost admire them in some ways. Because I think that's also, there's a difference between trying to just hype someone up and be like, oh, like you're so special, like you're so like unique, like whatever, versus actual encouragement, which is what I think the students need and what they needed, especially going into that night when I don't know if people knew that the sweep would happen or that the rest would happen, but I think, like Mary was saying, one of the groups that's linked with the encampment, Writers Against the War on Gaza, which is like a national or like an international organization, like group, but they have like a Philly branch. Like they put out a statement that was very clearly, I think there were parts of it which felt very directly inspired by the teaching, which had happened the day, like the evening before. And yeah, I'm still honestly trying to make sense of like the moment and where it's going to go, but also I think, because I've also been thinking about like what does, I don't know, like sometimes when we would talk to the students at Encampment, it's like they'd be like, oh yeah, like we're debating whether we should have like barricades or whether we should have like like all this stuff. And I think like I've also been trying to figure out or just understand like because they use the word escalation a lot, and like what does escalation actually mean, and when is it necessary, and what is the political purpose of it? But I think recently, or like yesterday actually, the students at Harvard occupied 3 buildings on Harvard campus and named them each after. One was named after Hind, the little girl in Gaza who was killed, which is the same thing that the Columbia students named Hamilton Hall after, Hind's Hall. And then they named another building that they occupied after another Palestinian girl who was killed. And there's like this horrific image of her mangled body like hanging from a fence after a bombing. And then they named the other building after, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed by Israel, before the genocide. And I think that's part of it too, where I feel like, at least from what I was observing and what I feel, is part of what allows the students to not be totally defeated by this is because they know they're not alone, and because there's so many other students around the country who are going through like literally the exact same stuff and trying to work it out in real time, and trying to figure out what is actually the best response to the police crackdown. But yeah, I don't know. And then I think it's also like, but then like even beyond that, part of what I feel like gives them like the strength to keep going and to keep pushing and to try to do it in a principled way is like actually like the kinds of conversations that we had at the teach-in with like youth housing, because I think it was really, I don't know, there was just like, like Mary also said this, but I just feel like there was like a different, even for me, because like we've been in preschool for a while, like having been in preschool for a while, it felt like there was a different quality to the conversation that I felt, and I wasn't exactly sure what it was. Because I think I feel like you and Catherine were also saying things I hadn't heard before, which is interesting. Like when you were talking about how the Black proletariat in Philadelphia is they're an old presence in the city. And I hadn't heard that particular framing of it before, even though we've talked about the Black proletariat in Philly for a long time. And then I think just the way that you and Catherine were both talking about what happens in movements and really focusing on the kinds of personalities of people who are able to become, I think the way you put it was like long-term revolutionaries. And I think this is exactly the moment when those students are thinking about all of those questions. And I think that there's also, like the last thing I'll say is that it reminded me of the way that Baldwin talks about King in The Dangerous Road before Martin Luther King, where part of what made King so powerful as a leader was that he knew his audience, like he knew who he was speaking to, and he knew the kinds of thoughts that they were thinking about, the questions that they had, and what was actually happening inside their hearts. And I feel like that's really important, where like I think there's a really important role in place for like rallies and people, like chanting and stuff. And I feel like that has been part of it, but I feel like part of it too is like the actual search for knowledge, like we've been talking about. But
the thing that struck me about the teach-in was I also felt like there was something new too, and part of it was that I was actually surprised. So actually, I was in the front, so I didn't see anyone's reaction. But at least I felt like that the people who did come to listen to the teach-in were the people who self-selected because they were interested in essentially the unspoken question of where do we go from here. I think the people who stayed in their tents and all their stuff, I assumed were basically ultra-leftists who or I just assumed they were probably like the people who kind of they're there to just be part of it, but maybe it's not as authentic or genuine of I'm questioning the identity of myself, my role, and also this country. And I felt like that was really interesting too. And I could feel that people were very focused, especially on what you were saying, Doc, because the one thing I really liked, well, first of all, I was also very moved. I think it was so important that you started out by saying you guys should be proud of yourselves. You're probably the only person in their lives, and I know this person because my own parents would never say it to me, but like it's very important for someone like you to basically validate young people and say like you have done something so important, because this is a culture, like this society, especially with social movements, social justice, it's one of guilt.
Right.
Of making people feel like, oh, you didn't do, people are never rewarded or validated for actually doing good. Instead, you're made to feel guilty, like you're actually privileged. Oh, like, oh, you think you're doing so much by coming, well, you know what, you're privileged because you're this, you're that. No one wants to say, no one, like, especially not with the moral authority of you, Doc, ever comes in and tells these students, like, it is exactly because you are an elite student at an elite university and you're making this choice that you should feel proud of yourself. Like, you are doing something that's very important. No, you did.
I think I said,
Oh.
we owe you a debt of gratitude.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the point, that the nation owes you a debt of gratitude.
Yes.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
I don't mean to.
Well, I felt like it was, but
I probably said what you said also.
it's important because.
And there's no other way around it. Anybody that thinks about what they are doing, we owe them a debt. And I'll speak when I speak, but there ain't no other way around. It ain't no back in the days, 1968.
No, there's no
It's a new
comparison.
qualitative level. And we have to, well, I'll talk, because I was, go ahead, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, it's okay, because then the other thing, well, I'm just repeating what you said. The other thing I thought was important you said was, you were like, well, this is also the ultimate reflection I had, which was, I thought it was also important when you said, what matters more? You spoke something that maybe students think or never phrased it like this, but you said it clearly, where you said, what matters more? Like what how the administration receives you, or how other people receive you, or is it that the love that you have because of what you have done, and the fact that the people in Gaza respect you and have things you, or does that matter more?
Being on the right side of
History. And because I think there's something important about you, and basically you injecting the dimension of the revolutionary spirit, and to also say that it is revolutionary to define your life by something eternal or infinite, and that is the morals by which you live. And it's that sort of spirit that I think is so important for people like at Penn to say, like, what is more important, that you have gained the respect and love of the people of Gaza, or everything else, the money, the jobs, the internships, the friends, like even your parents, or like, and I think that's very emotional, like to have someone like you validate that. And to say like, no, you're doing good and keep doing it. Because I'm sure these people's parents don't. And I actually kind of disagree. I think Catherine definitely said, I think you maybe felt, you said it, but I kind of disagree with this thing that young people or the students don't need you guys. Like, I really disagree with that.
I didn't say that.
Okay, well, I disagree with the sentiment of like, because I really disagree with the sentiment that.
So I think there were differences of emphasis between Catherine and myself, and I don't. Maybe if you ask me, I'll speak about that.
Yeah.
And the differences of emphasis has to do with who attends free school. But anyway, I don't mean.
Yeah, well, because
we're not the same, and we were not
right.
speaking the same way.
Yeah, I felt like you guys were different. Like the emphases were clearly different, and I think.
And the only reason I say this is, I think it is important, the integrity of what is said, and I don't want myself to be confused with a general thing.
No,
I'll explain that.
No, you're specific. Yeah, it's specific. Well, because.
And forgive me if I.
No. I understand. Yeah, I understand, because I agree. To me, it was very obvious that there were different. Well, because you're also, first of all, you're two different people, and I also think that's why I think you imbued a revolutionary spirit that was very important, because you were also saying you don't have to do this alone. Like you don't have to do this alone. And I'm here, but not just you, but you're speaking from the Black proletariat, like the struggle of the Black proletariat for freedom. Like and I thought that was really important because I also just think at least I know how impacted my life, but I think for young people, especially students at a place probably at Penn, because I'm a student. I was a student at Cornell when I came to free school, but I think there's something important about that they were able to like experience the line being drawn in the sand, or that just a thing of I think it's really important for people to know that there's something real. And the real deal or the real, and the real is that the real belongs to the Black proletariat, but it's also something that you have access to. Like this is your heritage. And that you don't have to be alone. Like, and I think like you belong to something, and it's not you versus like everyone else in the country. It's actually us versus like the state, injustice. And I'm sure like what you said was hearing you talk actually brought me back to like when I was at college too. And so I think what you said was going to be very meaningful, like not just ideologically, but also meaningful in people's lives. And that's why I also think people really need you. And
Catherine gave me a ride over, and on my way over there, I was cursing because I was gearing myself up like Nuri. I was putting on my battle garments. I thought we were going to have to go into an ideological struggle. I thought the disruptors and the move imitators were going to try to take over and create an atmosphere hostile to us and to the students, which, by the way, they have been trying to do, to put, as you say, put the students down. Like I even heard, on Facebook, one person, Haas in particular, say y'all need to go to some small town and talk to white people, white poor people. And the question is, what white people you talk to? But anyway, I was gearing and I was, but it was so the opposite. And I have to really thank you all, particularly Nuri, for beautiful John. And because, as you say, we were sitting up front so you could see the people, and everyone was very attentive, very respectful, and I know what a disrespectful audience can do. I know the body language. I know what they try to communicate to other people. Don't take this serious because it's not, but none of that. And I was not, when I said, because I'd said it here in free school, that the nation owes these students a debt of gratitude because they've contributed to the struggle for world peace and preventing a third world war. There ain't no other way to look at it. At a privileged university or not at a privileged university, this contribution cannot be erased. And I felt afterwards in speaking to a group of students that I had made friends, that I was talking to friends, and I hope I have a chance, Nuri, to meet them again. We talked about everything, including their idea that 1968 was of a greater magnitude than this. And I said, no, that's not true. And you're right about the draft driving 1968. And that's part of the reason they did away with the draft and created a professional army, or to create these what do you call them? Like in Ukraine, what do we call them?
Mercenaries? Mercenaries?
Not mercenaries, but where someone else fights your war for you. A proxy war, yeah, proxy armies. And so that's what Israel in a sense is. And so how do you go from a direct personal self-interest in not going to the draft in 68 and so on to now this, where you don't have a lot individually to gain, but at the higher level of humanity, you have everything to gain. And I was so interested because I asked, well, how did you all get to this? How was this? Because I can't explain it. And they gave many explanations, including the shutdown of COVID, even 9/11, and a number of things. And we were trying to figure it out, and we didn't. But this is extraordinary. And just one quick other thing. This idea of a pre-revolutionary situation, which I did not explain, unfortunately, but a revolution in this Kingian sense, this Baldwinian sense. What is a pre-revolutionary situation? Is it whatever, all of this. The other thing is, I have to say, I agree, I'm so happy to hear y'all say that the students are defiant. They have done something, and I tried to say to them, no, don't. I mean, like, I'm from back in the days. Okay, I opposed the draft, I wouldn't go, and all of that. But I mean, when I look at the anti-apartheid movement, it never reached anywhere near this level. We wanted it to, but it didn't. We agitated, we did whatever we could. We could not achieve what these students are achieving. We just couldn't. And for 100 universities all across the country, and to stand up for their freedom of speech, and then relent against the US state. The state has come down. Okay, it's not, they don't have a Kent state, a Jackson state in 1970. But that's because the ruling class cannot use those methods again. It's not because what the students are doing is not of a higher magnitude, believe me. And I just felt grateful to be a part of something like this. There were so many questions that you asked, Nuri, that I don't have answers for. And I didn't feel myself to be a teacher in a classroom telling people what to do or telling them, no, nope. I don't feel that way. I feel myself to be, well, this idea of students and young people. Well, if you're a revolutionary, you feel a part of the people. I didn't feel that I'd come out of my rocking chair in my retirement and I should be. I'm trying to think, well, where'd that come from?
Right.
When did you cease being a part of the people? I thought that was a wrong formulation, and I expressed it as such. I felt the students have done so much for world humanity. And it's, look, there's one. They shifted the balance and deepened the crisis of the US state. See, the Israeli and US states are inseparable. It's like one state. This is very important. They have a single objective. Ideologically, the Israeli state is identical with the US state, or however you want to put it. And to deepen this crisis of the state, of the US state, deepens the crisis of the Israeli state. These students and Jewish students are creating a crisis in Israel that the demonstrators in Israel don't have the courage to do, have not stood up to their regime in the way that these students have. And to come down with that military force the way they did, to terrorize the students, it takes more than most people can even imagine. And I feel proud that the Black movement is paralleling this at Xavier University in Louisiana, a Black college, and every Black college is dirt poor compared to University of Pennsylvania or Harvard. They don't have big endowments. They rely upon what the states can give them and so on. At Xavier University, the administration driven by the students was forced to revoke its invitation to the US ambassador to the UN, a Black woman. I think University of Vermont, which is not a Black college, also revoked it. But this Black college, and it takes a lot more for them to do it because of the precarious financial situation they live in. And again, the 1,000 Black ministers, the AME Church, Morehouse College calling for them to revoke Biden's coming there. So the students are not alone at all. And I think part of the problem of the police force in Philly and the mayor, and this is why the heavy hand of Shapiro, the governor, a cold-blooded, unapologetic Zionist, which then puts him in the camp of Nazism. Don't come around me. By the way, they were considering him to be the first Jewish president of the United States. I think they have to take that off the agenda. But I think Sherelle Parker, the mayor of Philadelphia, knows that Black Philadelphia ain't feeling her on this. And they said it even during the campaign. But this is a great moment for us to be alive, and we are the beneficiaries of the courage of these young students. And in my conversation, we never met. We don't know each other, but we became friends. And I would say they are, as surfing, it's a new quality. A new human being is being born out of this struggle. So I'd like to thank you, Nuri.
It sounds like you're about to end, so I wanted. Okay, I'll just keep going. I saw Jerome. This goes back to what we talked about in the beginning about Martin Luther King and his connection to, or his understanding of civilization. And I saw Jerome had commented, and I've been talking to Jerome at Mosque number 12, and I've asked him about some articles he's written, and he sent me this article about I think the title is something of, Martin Luther King, Pan-Africanist, ? And it talks about his early trip to Africa. So, we talked about his trip to India and Du Bois's trip to China, but both of them were also, interested in visiting Africa. And the article posed the question, why is so much known about, Muhammad Ali did this and that, and Martin Luther King, had a dream speech. But why does no one talk about, their trips to Africa collectively? It seems to be a dark spot.
Yeah, this is not related to that, but also with what you said about your coworkers, and I don't know, I guess like political means, but I feel like it's just like a brief comment, but I think part of what is driving the reaction, at least that I've seen from like Trump people, at least, and this is mostly online, like the student protest, is actually, I think that Trump people are jealous. I think that Trump people are jealous that like they were the ones who felt oppressed by the state, and now the students are actually receiving a much more blatant and much harsher crackdown. And it's almost like they don't know what to make of it because they're like, oh, look, I thought we were supposed to be the ones who were receiving the harshest punishment.
Oh, yeah. I can see envy all over the place
Yeah.
for these so-called privileged students.
Yeah, and because part of it is they, at least from, just like from what I see on like Twitter and stuff, it's like they're like, oh, like, why do these privileged students care so much about this other country? They should go to Gaza and like move there. And it's like one obvious, like I feel like it's so obvious that the students are saying, like first, like it's not that it's like one, literally our government is involved, has been involved from the very beginning, and is funding and doing what's happening. But also, I think this is something that the Trump movement, regardless of the specific question of Trump himself, but the people who are part of the Trump movement, what they're going to have to face is precisely this question of the human. Because what they can't get their heads around is, why is it that these young students feel that they are responsible to what happens to the children of Gaza? It's because the students, in whatever way that they are, and however early and premature, or like not yet fully mature they are, or like just like how not yet fully mature our generation is, we're reaching towards basically a concept of the human, and that we feel that we are connected to what happens to people, especially because of our responsibility as American citizens, but even on a higher level of like King would say, like we're all bound in that single garment of destiny, and that I think is where the Trump movement is not yet, not even
that's right. That's right, because Trump himself has discredited himself by his comments about King.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? And comments about that that black man running for Senate in North Carolina, saying this guy is way more than King. This kind of race. It's a moment of truth for them.
Well, what I've heard more from at least my white union members who are Trumpers is what they post on Facebook is more that they think the protesters are un-American. What it goes to is more of a question of what's your definition of America, like, because I think it is this thing of they still believe that it's the whole thing of what you had said at your intro last week about Make America. There will be no Make America Great Again because who said it was great to begin with? Right. And part of the issue is
I said you can't make America great again if you're trying to make imperialism.
Right.
I'm sorry.
And because
they don't see. Okay. Just like your union inviting Biden in the face of all of this, and your union's supposed to be led by social democrats.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So but it is. I think it is still the Baldwinian paradox of the white question.
It does go back to that. Yeah. Well, but that's also that's the qualitative specialness about the student movement is that they are actually getting closer to answering, or at least asking the same question that Baldwin brought up, which is, is like your new sense of self going to be dependent on the old definitions or new definitions, new standards or a new identity of even what America is? Because I think that's the issue with like the Trump movement is how can it be that you're basically against the state but then at the same time, you want to uphold the
Yeah,
state.
and you support January 6th.
Right.
And you're going to exonerate all of them, but yet you're calling for the police to come down on a peaceful demonstration. And your January 6th, them people wasn't peaceful.
No.
You know, they came with hammers and pistols and everything else. So I'm not hating, but
Yeah.
how you gonna have it both ways?
Yeah.
So, oh,
But I was going to suggest comments and
oh yeah,
then
then we
sign
could, yeah, then we could do
Yeah, but
the,
you can say.
No, I didn't have very much to say because I think collectively everybody just said everything I felt about the teaching. But I do think it's important to, sort of give a testimony because this was very moving for me because I've had a very difficult relationship with Penn, just working there. And for me, it's always just been just a job because I didn't know what the basis would ever be for me to be able to relate to it as an institution of learning, of knowledge. Lotus was the only way, our reading group was the only way for me to make sense of Penn, but also the American University in general. But even in Lotus, the way I saw it was almost like within Penn to create a sanctuary for ideas to live, for ideas to grow. But I feel like this moment with the student protests and the courageous stand that they have taken really also made possible a different kind of Lotus right now, and it's become broader in my mind. Its mandate has become broader in my mind. And personally, it was very, very moving because I feel like now the question in my mind is what is Penn? Is it the institution, the administration, the leadership, the buildings, or is it these students? And if it is these students, then there will have to be a new Penn, and the possibility of a new relationship.
But some of the comments from the beginning were, unless you want to do them, where Don DeVar says, "Good morning, the class of civilizations and the remaking of the world order." And then someone named Katie Jen said, "The USSR was a force for peace. The fall of the Soviet Union led to ongoing imperialist forever wars." And then Todd, Allison / Ali, I think, Todd, Ali, M. Sparks, all say good morning. Don DeBar says, "But grammatically, Russian is very much like Greek and Latin."
Russia is very well.
Grammatically, Russian is more similar to Greek and Latin.
No.
And then Christopher Ramirez says, "Good morning." And then Jerome says, "Excellent quote, Doc. So appropriate to what's happening all around us." I think I actually took note of which part he was replying to, but I forgot it.
What's the king quote?
Oh yeah, that's the chaos.
Oh, the king, yeah, from the book. Oh, where did we go from? Yeah.
Daniel Gutierrez says, "James Baldwin had a huge impact on me in college. I was lucky to take a seminar on him with a Baldwin scholar." I'd be interested to know who the Baldwin scholar is. And then Christopher Romero says, "Dr. Montero, you just burned my breakfast because your intro was fire." Whoa. And then David Crow said, the free school is my advanced degree course. Thanks. And Todd quoted Nuri and said, Todd is quoting Nuri and saying, "You only protected me because you thought I was on your side."
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But maybe, we can end with the updates on the upcoming science symposium.
I can go. So very short because I guess we're closing almost at closing time. But June 1st and 2nd, we're going to have a conference on the question of the crisis in science and knowledge, where the title that we decided for it is "The Crisis of Knowledge and the American University, James Baldwin and the Struggle for Our Human Future." Okay. And I think even the way I had started thinking about the science conference before all of this, before this just surge of the student protests and so on, significantly changed, because at this point it's very clear that if you're going to do something on science and knowledge, we also have to address the question of the crisis of the university, because it is at the center of, the crisis in this country itself. So we're still working on what the venue is going to be. For Sunday, it's probably going to be here in the Unitarian Church. We're still trying to figure out what Saturday is going to be, where it's going to be. And on the first day, which is June 1st, we are going to start with an introduction of framing, where first of all, we are writing a call for this conference. And so we're going to start with that and really frame the conference, keeping this crisis in the center, what's happening with the students, but also how it's directly related to the crisis of the state. And the first panel that we have, we are planning to do is going to, again, directly be on the question of the university and its ties to Zionism, its ties to the war economy, and the consequences this has for knowledge itself. What kind of knowledge can even be produced under the conditions? So it will be named something, we'll figure out the titles, but
But what I think we gave it a name. I think it's very striking.
Yes, we have tentative titles. I think so. For this panel, the tentative title we have is "The University as an Arm of the State," and the
Zionism.
Subtitle.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the university as an arm of the state, Zionism, the war economy, and the consequences for knowledge.
Yeah, we wanted to highlight the Zionist ideological role in the university.
Right.
Because the question is Zionism an obstacle to knowledge?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
That's
right. Can you say the title again?
It's the university as an arm of the state, Zionism, the war economy, and the consequences for knowledge.
We have long titles right now, which we'll probably shorten later on. But anyway, so we were going to talk explicitly about the role the university plays in deindustrialization, in gentrification, but also in propping up the military industrial complex, and how, it's so beholden to Zionist money and Zionist political, ideological agenda that, the mandate that it's supposed to carry, which is, upholding knowledge and upholding truth, always cannot ever, be at the forefront of the university's concerns. And then in this panel, we also explicitly want to talk about the effect this has on students, who come to the university to be able to make their education useful, to make a contribution to society. But then the demoralization that you have to go through, this cynicism that creeps in, and basically you're left in a situation where you can't even imagine a future, And then we also want to have an element in it where we, like we said, directly address the consequences this has for knowledge and science produced by institutions like this in the first place. I'm going to keep the descriptions a little short. After this, what we want to do is a roundtable discussion where, again, we are working on the title, but it's going to be something it's going to basically assert that there is a tradition for scientific practice and knowledge production that's rooted in the Black freedom tradition. And this is a time for us to get the revolutionary chronology of America straight, right? Because the process of producing knowledge and the purpose with which it is produced always depends on certain philosophical assumptions, ideological assumptions, and where you begin is important. So if you start in Europe and you start with Enlightenment values of rational thought and the individual over the human being, or even base revolutionary theory on a dogmatic reading of Marx, well, then you can't explain the world and its movement, especially in this moment where we are basically talking about a fundamental realignment. And so, you have to go back to the Bois, you have to go back to Black Reconstruction. And I think Shambarto had put it like this when we were discussing, is if you don't see the Civil War and Black Reconstruction as the Second American Revolution, you cannot see King and the
That's
civil
what
rights
you
movement
can't
as a
see.
third,
Yeah.
and then you don't have a basis for imagining what the fourth is even going to look like. And so in this roundtable, we also want to discuss more theoretically some aspects of revolutionary theory as propounded by Du Bois, Winston, but then we also want to talk about nonviolence as basically science with deep philosophical roots in civilizational values, and like basically connect that to the student movement right now, because essentially what they're doing is also nonviolence and civil disobedience against the state. But then for it to be sustained and to have a long-term strategy and moral stamina, you really need to return in some ways to the Third American Revolution. So that's the broad mandate for this roundtable, and this would be the end of the first day. In the second day, we start with a panel where we talk about, this one we did to have a title that's figured out, where we're going to call it, Will Science Free Humanity or Eliminate the Human Being? And here we talk about, the relationship between theory, ideology, and practice, but also postmodernism as the superstructure on which, spanning disciplines, be it the natural sciences or the social sciences, the very process of knowledge production is rooted in some ways. So in physics, it gives you something like string theory, which is basically an assertion that the world cannot be known, or AI, where, basically what you're saying is the human beings have reached the capacity of knowledge. And so now anything new will just come from machines or whatever. And in that same panel, we also want to talk about the social sciences, somebody like a Judith Butler, postmodernism's theses that the truth is unattainable. And, this is just absurd. All you can talk about is subjective truths, which separates people into categories of identity or, experience or whatever. So it removes the very basis for unity, And then this one we need to work it out a little more, but we also want to talk about the relationship of theory to practice, where we want to talk a little bit about the left and the labor movement and their application of what, revolutionary theory is to an understanding of who the working class even is, or how to relate with them or to engage with them, or their conception of a future, which we argue they don't have one. So yeah, that's sort of the broad thrust of that panel. And then we have another roundtable planned for that day, which is, pretty much what we discussed for the first 2.5, 3 hours today, is this question of knowledge, civilization, and the new human being, but through a synthesis of Baldwin and Du Bois.
Yeah, this is going to be
Yeah.
explosive.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go into a lot of it because we still have to work this out a lot. But basically, we are trying to ask the question: what will be the basis on which this new human being will be born? What will be the basis for any science, any art, anything, for the future? And the assertion we are trying to make is this again requires a return to Baldwin and Du Bois. The centrality of the human being, and what we discussed today, that for them, intellectual activity was never separate from the revolutionary imperative. The revolutionary imperative being human liberation, and therefore, the achievement of human civilization. So then we want to highlight specific philosophical elements or formulations that Baldwin and Du Bois both have and share, which speak to one another. One is the fundamental emphasis on love as the basis for human relationships, not power, not authority, like Doc was saying, but love as that as the thread that binds humanity together in a single garment of destiny. And then we also want to talk about complexity, how unlike how postmodernism tries to hide behind complexity by saying, oh, it's too complex, so nothing can be done. Baldwin instead, and Du Bois also in his formulation of law and chance, is basically saying that no, it's actually, it enriches the truth. Human diversity, complexity, it creates the possibility of a richer truth and the fullness of the human experience. And so we want to bring in these elements and draw them out in discussion to talk about what the future is going to look like. And perhaps, this question of where do we go from here could be like a girding principle for the roundtable.
Yeah.
So that's what we have so far. We're still working some of these things out, and who will speak on what. But yeah.
That was
long.
No, and one thing, this is an ambitious endeavor that tries to relate the moment with the future. And, we talked a bit because, with the with our celebration of April 4th, there was a little stabbing in the back going on, and I don't appreciate it, especially when the person that stabbed us in the back claimed she didn't know what the whole thing was about. And then I see her over at the encampment with the Saturday Fake School holding up a copy of Black Reconstruction. In a lot of ways, some of these complicated issues, we have to shoulder the responsibility for the fight for clarity. And that's, we can't tolerate, in the name of some kind of unity, people consciously trying to sabotage what we're doing. If we're doing Baldwin, don't bring Audre Lorde up in here. I hope you're listening. Go ahead.
I forgot to say one thing, which is that we are dedicating the symposium to Stephen Jay Gould, which we discussed before. But the reason why we want to dedicate it to him is because he is an example of a moral scientist, a person who did not separate himself from the people. In fact, there is that aspect of the revolutionary work that he did in evolutionary biology, but then also a thing that's really compelling about him is the way he would write his books and the way he would talk about, his research or, his scientific discoveries is also in a way where he did not believe that knowledge was restricted to a few elite people or like experts, but was in fact, something that belonged to everybody, so if knowledge moves forward, it moves forward with all of humanity or not at all. And, he also strongly opposed this school of, biological determinism, which would assert that, there are evolutionary, genetic, cause for human beings to act in a warlike manner or in racist fashion or whatever. And he spent his life opposing this ideological framework. And so in general, in modern times, he represents to us the example of a scientist who was not just a scientist, but thought of science as a service to humanity.
What's his name? Stephen
Jay Gould.
Yeah, it's gonna be really. I think it's gonna be a really great conference.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And we said we want to make the best use of Nandathan Raju.
Yeah, very, very nice. Good. Well, with that was a great preschool. We're gonna end now. So to all of our commenters and listeners, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week, next Saturday. Goodbye.
Bye.